Chapter 230 The Toyo Fiasco, 5th Update, please subscribe. The Oriental Empire, Dongjing, and the Prime Minister's Office. Lieutenant General Teraki Masaki, Minister of the Army, and General Anyun, Chief of Staff of the Army and Commander of the Manchurian Army, were as anxious as ants on a hot pot. After the news of the annihilation of the 4th Army and the 5th Army came, they became very nervous. They all knew that the annihilation of the 4th Army and the 5th Army by the Russians was only the beginning. Next, if they don't want to do it again, I am afraid that what awaits them is that all the troops dispatched to the Koryo Peninsula and the Liaodong Peninsula will be wiped out. This is undoubtedly an extremely heavy blow to the Eastern Empire. Your Excellency Prime Minister, haven't the people who never set the sun replied yet? Didn't they keep saying they want to help us? Don't they want to watch our elite troops be eaten by the Russians? 987 in the temple Lieutenant General Genji asked. Advertisement. Yes, Your Excellency Prime Minister. Although the formation of the 6th Army has been completed, it already has millions of people. However, this is a hastily mobilized army after all. Whether it is the quality of the soldiers or the weapons and equipment, it cannot be as good as before. Compared with the elite troops. Once those elite troops are lost, the consequences will be disastrous. General Dashanyan also said. The Prime Minister, General Guitaro, was also pale at the moment. I have asked Mr. Komura to contact the people who never set the sun many times. The people who never set the sun claim that they are negotiating with the Russians. However, the Russians are very firm and claim that unless we are willing to accept their conditions, otherwise, their military operations will not stop. General Guitaro said. The conditions of the Russians are so harsh, how can we accept their conditions? If we accept those conditions, is there any hope for the future of the empire? Lieutenant General Masaki Teraoki looked angry. The sun never sets, don't people have other options? They are the overlords of the world. General Dashanyan was also very dissatisfied. General Guitaro shook his head. The people on whom the sun never sets obviously don't want to really tear themselves apart with the Russians. In other words, they don't want to personally intervene in this war. So, although they are helping us, they are putting pressure on the Russians. But, it's always been that bottom line. Damn. The sun never sets and people are so afraid of wolves and tigers, what should we do? General Dashanyan scolded. I will ask Mr. Komura to continue negotiating with the people who never set the sun, so that the people who never set the sun will actively find a way. However, it is very difficult to say whether it will be effective. General Guitaro is also very helpless on this issue. Minister. Advertisement. Hi, Your Excellency the Prime Minister. Lieutenant General Genji and General Dashanyan replied one after another. However, they are also very clear. This time, they may have to prepare for the worst. Once the sun never sets, people have no effect. Then, the troops they sent to the battlefield must be prepared to be wiped out. Thinking of this, the hearts of Lieutenant General Genji and General Dashanyan in the temple felt as if they were bleeding. Liaodong Peninsula, south of Shehi River. Although, the Shehi River is now in the wet season. However, the surface of the Shehi River is not originally wide. In addition to the west of the Shehi River, there is still a large piece of land. This made the 2nd Army and the 3rd Army of the Eastern Army, even if they assembled heavy troops. However, whether it is General Abeogong or the arrogant General Nogi, they have no confidence in whether they can withstand the Russian attack. Mr. Nemu, the Russians are frantically adding troops to the Shehi line of defense. It is expected that they will launch an attack on us soon. The 4th Army and the 5th Army have been eaten by the Russians. They can now use several 100,000 troops are coming to deal with us. This time, we may be doomed. General Abeogong's face was pale, and he had a feeling that his death was imminent. General Nogi Zidian was very stubborn. Ao Jun, we are the most loyal subjects of His Majesty Tian Huang. For us, the best destination is to die on the battlefield. Although the Russians are very powerful, we will fight them desperately all right. I believe that Kujuanzaka will definitely have a place for us. I am already very satisfied to be remembered by future generations. Nogi Zidian can be said to be Mingzi Tianhuang's most loyal courtier. For the sake of Mingzi Tianhuang, even life is not necessary. In another time and space, he chose to be buried for Mingzi Tianhuang after Mingzi Tianhuang died. In this time and space, he could not wait for Mingzi Tianhuang to pass away, so he could only take a step ahead. Order all our troops, prepare to fight to the end, said General Nogi Nozomi. General Abeogong nodded, and he knew very well that they had no other choice. On August 15, 1804, the main force of the Tsarist Russian army began a fierce attack on the 2nd Army and the 3rd Army of the Eastern Army. Advertisement. The local fleet of the Tsarist Russian Navy also mobilized a large number of warships to prepare for firepower due to the army's attack. 6 Mikhaili-class battleships, 6 Mosk-class heavy cruisers, 6 Rostov-class light cruisers and some A-class destroyers, all joined in. The powerful naval artillery firepower caused the defense line deployed by the Eastern Army along the coast to be severely damaged. At the same time, the casualties are also very large. In order to avoid greater casualties, the Second Army and the Third Army of the Eastern Army even had to abandon the coastal defense line. This allowed the main force of the Russian army to easily cross this part of the area and began to besiege the Eastern Army. These Orientals are still very brave and tenacious, and they are simply brave and fearless. However, with such a large gap in strength between the two sides, no matter how brave they are still powerless, let alone reverse the situation. With the support of powerful firepower, the Russian army continued to destroy the fortifications of the Orientals with fierce artillery fire, weakening their vitality 5.0. Then, under the cover of our own powerful machine gun firepower and support firepower, we launched an attack on the defense line of the Orientals. Such a tactic, the Orientals simply cannot resist. In just 10 days, the Second and Third Armies of the Eastern Army had already suffered fatal blows. They even abandoned the Shehi line of defense and retreated to the city of Dalian, intending to hold out stubbornly here. But in the end, it still didn't have much effect. On August 29, the Russian army captured the Great Union. The Second Army and the Third Army of the Eastern Army were completely wiped out. Among them, more than 50,000 Japanese surrendered. The rest of the Orientals were all killed in battle. So far, the troops deployed by the Eastern Army on the battlefield, except for the First Army, have been completely wiped out by the Tsarist Russian Army. Chapter 231 Toyo Summoning, First Update, please subscribe. The Second Army and the Third Army of the Eastern Army were annihilated by the Tsarist Russian Army, making the main force of the Tsarist Russian Army already annihilated by the Tsarist Russian Army. Even if the Eastern Army is still sticking to the Koryo Peninsula, there are still as many as 9 infantry divisions. However, of the 9 infantry divisions under the First Army of the Eastern Army, except for the 3 infantry divisions drawn from the Fifth Army that remained at full strength, the remaining 6 infantry divisions were all relatively large. Especially the Guards Division, the 2nd Infantry Division and the 12th Infantry Division, which were the first troops to land on the Koryo Peninsula, suffered losses of more than 50%. Under such circumstances, it is almost impossible for the First Army of the Eastern Army to defend the line of defense of the Yalu River and resist the attack of the Russian Army. Advertisement. Especially when the Russian Army has mastered the sea, it can land at the core area of the Koryo Peninsula by sea at any time and launch an attack on the Orientals. This made the First Army of the Oriental Army almost certain to die. At the same time, because the Eastern Army suffered heavy losses on the battlefield. In other words, Dongyang Empire 03 has no hope of winning in this battle. This made the top management of the Eastern Empire have other ideas about this war. In other words, we have to accept this reality. Winter Capital, the Imperial Palace. Ming Zetian Huang convened 1,000 high-level cabinet and military officials to hold an imperial meeting. My lords, I am very disappointed and even more heartbroken that this war has ended like this. The empire has prepared for 10 years, but in the end it was completely defeated. Is it because we are too weak, or our enemy is too strong? Are you done? Ming Zetian Huang looked disappointed and decadent. Originally, he was still dreaming of defeating the Tsarist Russian Empire and stepping on the Tsarist Russian Empire to rise to become a world-class power. But now, the cruel reality gave him a slap in the face and made him wake up. Advertisement. All the senior officials of the Eastern Army and Navy were ashamed. They all lowered their heads, as if they didn't dare to look at Ming Zetian Huang. Okay, gentlemen, this is the end of the matter. It is useless to say anything more. The current empire is already in an extreme predicament. So, how can we protect the interests of the empire to the maximum extent? Ming Zetian Huang asked. Your Majesty Tian Huang, we have to admit that we have already lost in this war, and we have lost badly. In other words, we no longer have the strength to defeat the Russians. If this war continues, the Russians will pose a greater threat to us. Even when they have mastered the sea, they can already directly threaten the safety of the empire. We should make peace with the Russians as soon as possible and end this war. Prime Minister Katsura sighed. Yes, Your Majesty Tian Huang. Finding a way to end this war is in the best interest of the empire at this stage. Minister of Foreign Affairs Komura Kotaro also echoed. Even the Minister of Finance Son Aresuk also expressed support. You know, in order to prepare for this war, the Eastern Empire is already heavily in debt. After more than half a year of war, the finances of the Eastern Empire almost collapsed. If the war continues like this again, it will cause a devastating blow to the economy of the Eastern Empire. If you can win this war, then blackmail the Russians severely after the war is over. Just like when they defeated the Qing Empire, they ruthlessly slaughtered the Qing Empire. In that case, the Eastern Empire may have a huge harvest. But now, they can no longer see the hope of victory. If the war continues, it will only cost them huge casualties. The generals of the army and navy of the Eastern Empire felt that it was a great shame to seek peace from the Russians. But the problem is that it is precisely because of their incompetence that the Eastern Empire has to do this. If they could defeat the Eastern Empire on the battlefield, it wouldn't be what it is now. There is indeed no problem in seeking peace from the Russians to end this war. But the most important thing is that the conditions of the Russians are too harsh. 3 billion rubles in war reparations is equivalent to the Lord's 1.3 billion. There are even more yen. How can we get so much war reparations? Lieutenant General Teraki Masaki asked rhetorically. Advertisement. 1,000 cabinet ministers fell silent for a moment. Indeed, it's not that they don't want to seek peace from the Russians, it's that the Russians' appetite is so great that the Eastern Empire can't afford it at all. You know, after the Eastern Empire defeated the Qing Empire, it extorted a total of 230 million taels of silver, which is only equivalent to 60 million pounds, and it was basically left alone. Now the appetite of the Russians is much bigger than theirs. Let the sun never set and continue to mediate and negotiate with the Russians. We can make some appropriate concessions. However, we cannot let the Russians kill us like fools. If the conditions of the Russians are not so harsh, we can sign an armistice treaty with the Russians to end this war. If the conditions of the Russians are still so harsh, then, at worst, we abandon the First Army and continue to fight the Russians. Among other things, it is always useless to stick to the homeland. 483 Question. Ming Zetian Huang gritted his teeth and said. If the Russians continue to open their mouths, the Eastern Empire will have no other way. The only thing they can do is stick to their ugliness. Although, the navy was almost wiped out, putting the Eastern Empire with a long coastline at an extremely disadvantageous position in the face of the threat of the Russians. It is undoubtedly very difficult to resist the threat of the Russians. However, at this point, they have no other choice. Hi, His Majesty Tian Huang. The cabinet of the Eastern Empire and the top military officials all replied one after another. Although, if the situation becomes more difficult, they will have to abandon the First Army. But for the generals of the Orientals, they certainly feel distressed, but that's all. In the minds of these generals of the Orientals, even if there are more than 100,000 officers and soldiers in the First Army, it is nothing more than a cold number. For the benefit of the Eastern Empire, everything is forgivable. Afterwards, Komura Toshitaro, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Eastern Empire, contacted Lin Dong, Minister of the Eastern Empire in the empire on which the sun never sets again, requesting that the Empire of the Sun never sets once again mediate the war between the Eastern Empire and the Tsarist Russian Empire, hoping to minimize the war. The point is to end this war. Chapter 232 Broken Jar and Broken Fall, Second Update, please subscribe. Russian Empire, Primorsky Far East, Vladivostok. Tsar Mikhail, Chief of General Staff General Bruzilov, and First Army Commander General Gurko have all returned here from Shenyang. As the Second Army and the Third Army of the Eastern Army were also annihilated by the Russian Army, only the First Army of the Eastern Army is still entrenched in the Koryo Peninsula. In terms of the strength of the Russian Army, it is not difficult to eat up the hundreds of thousands of the First Army of the Eastern Army. Therefore, Mikhail made General Kuropatkin, the commander of the Sixth Army, fully responsible for the operations on the Koryo Peninsula. He returned to Vladivostok to prepare for the next operation. Advertisement. Your Majesty, after a month-long high-intensity battle, the frontline troops need to rest for a period of time. At the same time, the ammunition is also consumed a lot and needs to be replenished urgently. General Kuropatkin suggested that the frontline troops should rest for half a month. Wait until the rest is over. At the same time, after the supply of supplies is completed, we will launch an attack on the Koryo Peninsula again. Admiral Bruzilov reported. Mikhail nodded. Although the Russian army is powerful, it is mainly based on extremely powerful firepower. Once the supply of ammunition is insufficient, it will seriously restrict the firepower of the Russian army. As a result, it will limit the combat effectiveness of the Russian army. In addition, the soldiers of the Russian army are also human beings, and they will also get tired. Therefore, in such a situation, take a break first, and then invest in the next attack, which is also conducive to the next battle. Mikhail will not have any opinion on this. Yes, let the frontline troops rest for a while. It just so happens that we can use this time to launch an attack on the mainland of the Eastern Empire, Mikhail said. Yes, Your Majesty, replied Admiral Bruzilov. Is the army ready? Asked Mikhail. Your Majesty, the 11th Infantry Division, the 12th Infantry Division, the 13th Infantry Division, the 14th Infantry Division and the 12th Marine Brigade are all ready. As soon as the order is given, we can attack immediately, replied Admiral Gurko. Mikhail has appointed Admiral Gurko to be fully responsible for the attack on the Eastern Empire. In terms of the troops currently deployed by the Toyo Army on Hokkaido Island, it is enough for the Russian Army to dispatch 4 infantry divisions and 1 Marine Brigade. However, if the Orientals try to increase their troops in the future, and even mobilize more troops, Then, the Russian army must increase its troops. Advertisement. Of course, judging from the current situation, none of this is a problem. Besides, with the Tsarist Russian navy already in control of the sea, it is not so easy for the Orientals to increase their troops to Hokkaido Island. Has a specific battle plan been drawn up? Mikhail asked. Your Majesty, under the cover of the navy, we plan to land in Hangan, Sapporo, Nemuro, Wakana, and Rumwa on the island of Hokkaido. Launch an assault on the entire island of Hokkaido. In the shortest time, the 2 infantry divisions deployed by the Orientals on Hokkaido Island were defeated. If our battle plan can be successful, we can take the entire Hokkaido Island in a very short time. However, the full cooperation of the navy is needed to prevent the Japanese from increasing their troops to Hokkaido Island. Otherwise, it is very likely that the Imperial Army will fall into a protracted war again. Admiral Gurko replied. Mikhail nodded, he also understood this. Hokkaido Island is already the mainland of the Eastern Empire. Once the Russian Empire raided the island of Hokkaido, then, the Orientals will definitely work hard. Even if they resist desperately, they will never let the Russians succeed. Unless, they have no choice but to watch Hokkaido Island fall. In order to avoid such a situation, the Tsarist Russian navy needed to implement a blockade on Hokkaido Island to prevent reinforcements from the Orientals from reaching Hokkaido Island. I will let the navy side fully support this combat operation. Mikhail said. Yes, Your Majesty. Admiral Gurko replied. That way, there shouldn't be any problems. The Eastern Empire Navy has been completely defeated. Once the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy invests its main force to block the Tsugaru Strait, the eastern people will be powerless. Unless the navies of other countries get involved. Of course, to be more precise, it is the navy that never sets. Judging from the current situation, the Orientals have already lost. Under such circumstances, it is very difficult to say whether a person who never sets will dare to participate in it. In other words, the possibility that the sun never sets will be involved is very small. Advertisement. Let's prepare for the troops. After 3 days, the buds will wilt on Hokkaido Island. It is best to take Hokkaido Island within half a month. Mikhail ordered. Yes, Your Majesty. Admiral Gurko was very confident about this. With 4 infantry divisions and 1 marine brigade, it is absolutely easy to deal with the 2 infantry divisions of the Orientals. At this time, the sun never sets on the mainland of the empire, the garden capital. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of the empire on which the sun never sets, Fitzmaurice, once again began to mediate the war between the Tsarist Russian Empire and the Eastern Empire. The Tsarist Russian Empire's ambassador to the empire on which the sun never sets, Peter Rovuk, and the Eastern Empire's minister to the empire on the sun never sets, Lindong, started negotiations. It's just that because the army of the Tsarist Russian Empire won an absolute victory on the battlefield, it has wiped out the main force of the Orientals. This made Ambassador Peter Rovuk's attitude even tougher during the negotiations. After all, the Orientals suffered a crushing defeat on the battlefield. Then, they undoubtedly have no room for bargaining in front of the Tsarist Russian Empire. However, after all, people who never set the sun do not want to watch the Eastern Empire being defeated by the Tsarist Russian Empire and severely injured by the Tsarist Russian Empire. They still do everything possible to put pressure on the Tsarist Russian Empire and provide help for the empire on which the sun never sets. The money is good. Therefore, they hope that the Russian Empire can make concessions. Under such circumstances, after consulting the country, Ambassador Peter Rovuk decided to make concessions in terms of war reparations, that is, from the previous asking price of 3 billion rubles. Concession to 200 billion rubles. A one-time concession of 1 billion rubles undoubtedly shows the sincerity of the Tsarist Empire. However, it is still impossible for the Eastern Empire to accept this request. 2 billion rubles is still a large sum of money to the Orientals, and they simply cannot and are unwilling to take it out. This makes it impossible for this negotiation to continue. In view of this, the top management of the Eastern Empire had to decide to break the kin and suspend the negotiations with the Tsarist Russian Empire. Even if the Tsarist Russian army ate the first army of the Eastern Army, they would not compromise and let the war continue. As long as they protect their homeland, there seems to be no problem. Chapter 233 Raid on Hokkaido Island, 3rd update, please subscribe. The Oriental Empire, Dongjing, and the Prime Minister's Office. General Katsura, Prime Minister of the Eastern Empire, has received a report from Minister of Foreign Affairs Komura Judaro on negotiations with the Russians. Your Excellency, from the current point of view, the attitude of the Russians is still very tough. They are still determined to blackmail the empire. Even if they reduce the amount of war reparations they demand from 3 billion rubles to 2 billion rubles seems to be 1 billion rubles less. Advertisement. However, this is still an astronomical figure. Even if the empire sells iron, it will not be able to get this money at all. Komura Kotaro said. General Guitaro nodded, of course he was unwilling to pay the money. Let alone whether the Eastern Empire has so much money, even if it does, he is definitely not willing to pay it. The Eastern Empire suffered such heavy losses in this war. Just because of the casualties of so many troops, it needs a lot of money to pay for it. In addition, the reconstruction of the army will also cost a lot of money. The reconstruction of the navy will burn even more money. If there is so much money, General Guitaro will only use all the money for the reconstruction of the army, instead of giving it to the Russians in vain. Your Excellency, Prime Minister, we must not allow the Russians to blackmail us like this, and absolutely cannot accept their conditions. Otherwise, we will never have a chance to stand up again. Army 08 Lieutenant General Zheng Yi also gritted his teeth said. If we don't accept these conditions from the Russians, then the Russians will continue to attack and annihilate the First Army. This war will also continue. General Guitaro said. They want to annihilate the First Army, so let them go. The soldiers of the First Army are all warriors of the Empire, and they must have been prepared to be loyal to the Empire. Even if they are wiped out by the Russians, he will do his best to cause even greater losses to the Russians, said General de Shanyan, Chief of Staff of the Army and Commander of the Manchurian Army. In the eyes of these people, it seems that the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in the First Army are not considered at all. As long as it is beneficial to the Eastern Empire, even if it is all abandoned, it is not a big deal. General Guitaro nodded after hearing this. He undoubtedly agrees with this point of view. However, we must also be prepared. If we persist and refuse to compromise, the Russians will definitely take further actions. For example, dispatching fleets to attack the ports of the Empire, or even attack the Empire's sea transport, ATF, lines, etc. Once the Russians do this, it will cause a lot of trouble to the Empire. General Katsura was also a little worried about this. Advertisement. Your Excellency Prime Minister, if this is the case, then we need the help of the people who never set. The people who never set are unable to suppress the Russians and cannot help us in the negotiations. However, there should be no problem in doing these small favors. Admiral Gonbei Yamamoto, Minister of the Navy, suggested. The Eastern Empire is a country that relies heavily on maritime trade, and even necessities such as food need to be shipped by sea. If the sea transportation line is cut off by the Russians, it will undoubtedly be a fatal blow to the Eastern Empire. However, in the face of such a problem, they have no way to deal with it. Who caused their navy to be almost wiped out? The few destroyers that are next to each other are not enough for the Russians to bite their teeth. This makes them only able to turn to the sun never sets. Although the sun never sets, people are very unreliable in many cases. However, the people on whom the sun never sets are the overlords of the sea after all. They have the most powerful navy in the world. This is their home field. If they can ensure that the mainland of the Eastern Empire will not be attacked, and that the maritime transportation lines of the Eastern Empire will not be threatened or cut off, then, they have nothing to fear. The day of contact never falls, so they must support us in this regard no matter what. General Guitaro said. Hi, Your Excellency the Prime Minister. Foreign Minister Komura Kodaro replied. The Sixth Army of the Imperial Army must strengthen its vigilance, strengthen its training, and replenish its weapons and equipment as much as possible. Once the mainland is threatened by the Russians, only the army can defend the mainland of the Empire at present. General Guitaro said. Hi, Your Excellency the Prime Minister. Lieutenant General Teraki Masaki, Minister of War, replied. Although, the Eastern Army suffered extremely heavy losses on the battlefield. However, under the crazy mobilization of the Eastern Empire Army, they have completed the mobilization and formation of the 34 infantry divisions of the 6th Army. The entire 6th Army has nearly 1 million troops. Of course, once the war is over, the Eastern Army will change its organization accordingly, and even abolish the army. After all, in terms of the current financial resources of the Eastern Empire, it simply cannot afford to support so many troops. Because the asking price of the Tsarist Russian Empire was too high, and the Eastern Empire refused to compromise, even if there was mediation by the sun never sets, the two sides could not reach an agreement for a long time. This made the negotiations between the two sides enter a stalemate again. Advertisement. However, at this time, the Tsarist Russian Empire made new moves. On September 2, 1804, the 11th Infantry Division, the 12th Infantry Division, the 13th Infantry Division, the 14th Infantry Division and the 12th Brigade of the Tsarist Russian Marine Corps secretly embarked from Vladivostok, under the protection of warships of the Navy's Pacific Fleet and a part of the Home Fleet, crossed the Whale Sea and headed directly to the island of Hokkaido. On the morning of September 4, it was just dawn. The Tsarist Russian Navy's Home Fleet and the Pacific Fleet began to carry out fierce shelling on the Hangin and Sapporo of the Hokkaido island of the Eastern Empire. Because of the disastrous defeat of the combined fleet of the Eastern Empire Navy, most of the warships were lost. As a result, the Eastern Empire's control over the surrounding waters has been weakened to the extreme. So much so that they knew nothing about the actions of the Tsarist Russian Navy. In other words, the Orientals never thought that the Tsarist Russian Empire dared to attack their homeland. Especially when the First Army of the Eastern Army has not been wiped out, and the Koryo Peninsula is still under the control of the Eastern Empire, the Tsarist Russian Empire will take the lead in launching an attack on the mainland of the Eastern Empire, which is simply beyond everyone's expectations. However, no matter what the Orientals think. However, the war has already begun. The Russian Empire's attack on the mainland of the Eastern Empire has already begun. Boom. Boom. Culver Tube offshore, Tsugaru Strait. 2 Mikhaili-class battleships and 2 Ekaterina-class battleships of the Tsarist Russian Navy are bringing several heavy cruisers and armored cruisers, as well as light cruisers and destroyers, to attack the 66th Infantry of the Eastern Army. The division positions opened fire. Chapter 234 Fighting with the Russians, 4th update, please subscribe. Boom. 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 One after another, the naval artillery shells slammed into the positions of the 66th Division of the Eastern Army Infantry. The power of the large-caliber naval guns is so great that the hastily built defense line of the Orientals is simply vulnerable, and is easily destroyed by these powerful naval guns. This is also impossible. The Orientals had already consumed a lot of resources in order to form 34 infantry divisions. Advertisement. Now, 34 infantry divisions have been formed again, and almost all the resources have been consumed. So much so that they simply have no extra resources to build a line of defense. In addition, they did not expect that the Tsarist Russian Empire would launch an attack on their homeland, and they were completely unprepared. So much so that they couldn't fight the naval guns of the Tsarist Russian Navy, especially the large-caliber naval guns. As these lines of defense were easily destroyed, the Eastern Army stationed on these lines of defense suffered extremely heavy losses. A large number of Japanese soldiers were blown to pieces directly in the battle. Under such circumstances, the 66th Division of the Eastern Army Infantry suffered heavy losses, and it is naturally impossible to resist the landing of the Tsarist Russian Army and Marine Corps. In Hangan City, the headquarters of the 66th Division of the Eastern Army Infantry. Your Excellency, Commander, the Russians have dispatched a large number of warships to launch fierce shelling on our defense line. At present, the defense line has been severely damaged, and the frontline troops have also lost a lot. Moreover, the Russians still have a large number of transport ships, and they will definitely dispatch troops. The landing was carried out. I am afraid it will be very difficult for us to resist the Russians' landing. Chief of Staff Sato Kane-take reported. Baga. Damn the Russians, they dare to attack the mainland of the Empire. This is absolutely unforgivable. Command the frontline troops to do their best to resist the Russian attack. In addition, immediately report to the Ministry of War and the General. The staff reported the situation. We need reinforcements. The head of the 66th Division of the Toyo Army Infantry, Kiyu Yasuna, angry. Hi, Your Excellency, head of the division. Chief of Staff Sato Kane-take, replied. By the way, what about other directions on Hokkaido Island? Are there Russians also launching an attack? Lieutenant General Kikoji Yasuna asked. Your Excellency, Division Commander, according to the information we have obtained so far, Sapporo, where our 131st Infantry Brigade is stationed, has also been attacked by Russians. In addition, Chinese people have also appeared in the northern part of Hokkaido Island, where our 67th Infantry Division is stationed. Senior Dr. Lian Yi replied. Advertisement. Damn. Damn Russians, are they trying to take down the entire Hokkaido Island? Lieutenant General Yasuna Kikoji's expression became more serious. If he thought that the Russian attack on Hokkaido Island before, it might be to deter the Eastern Empire and scare the Eastern Empire. Well, now the Tsarist Russian Empire is landing and launching attacks in various parts of Hokkaido Island. Then, the intention of the Tsarist Russian Empire is very obvious. It is clear that it wants to bring down Hokkaido. What? Under such circumstances, it is undoubtedly very, very difficult to defend Hokkaido Island by relying solely on the 66th Infantry Division and the 67th Infantry Division. Your Excellency, Division Commander, we have to prepare for the worst. Once the Russians use a large number of troops to attack Hokkaido Island, it may be difficult for us to resist. Colonel Sato Kane-take reminded. These infantry divisions of the 6th Army of the Eastern Army have just been mobilized. Although, the personnel are all reserve and rural soldiers. However, it is not a regular army after all. Many people have even retired for a long time. Even after a period of adaptive training, a certain amount of strength has been recovered. However, compared with the peak state, there is undoubtedly a very big gap. Especially in terms of weapons and equipment, even if the Eastern Empire sells iron, it cannot guarantee the equipment of these infantry divisions. Being able to barely manage to have a rifle in each hand is considered pretty good. There are even quite a few Japanese soldiers holding the golden hook rifles they used when fighting against the Qing Empire more than 10 years ago. Even the artillery, because of serious shortage, pulled out the bronze artillery used in the last war. Just ask, with such equipment, it is not easy to resist the attack of the main force of the Tsarist Russian army. Rescue, urgently ask Dongjing for help, we need reinforcements. Otherwise, we alone definitely not the Russian opponent. Lieutenant General Kiyu Yasuna knows this very well. Even if they fill in all the 2 infantry divisions stationed on Hokkaido Island, they are not the opponents of the Russians and will be eaten by the Russians soon. This is undoubtedly a great threat to them. 0. Ask for flowers. Boom. Boom. On the sea, warships of the Tsarist Russian Navy were still firing wildly. Advertisement. All the main guns, secondary guns, and rapid-fire guns are firing at the maximum rate of fire, as if these shells are completely free of money. After half an hour of firepower preparation, the 12th Brigade of the Tsarist Russian Marine Corps took the lead in landing on Hangan, followed by the 1st Infantry Division. As for the 12th Infantry Division, the 13th Infantry Division and the 14th Infantry Division, they chose to land in the rest of Hokkaido Island. For a time, the entire Hokkaido Island was besieged by the Russian army. Even if the 66th and 67th Divisions of the Oriental Army Infantry stationed on Hokkaido Island tried their best, they could not prevent the landing of the superior Russian troops. After all, the Russian army has command of the sea, and the landing force can receive strong fire support from the navy. If the Eastern Ocean Army wants to prevent the Russian army from landing, it has to deploy a strong force on the coast. And this often makes these troops the key targets of the Tsarist Russian Navy, paying heavy losses in vain. Under such circumstances, the Toyo army naturally cannot prevent the Russian army from landing on Hokkaido Island. At the same time, the news that the Tsarist Russian Empire launched an attack on Hokkaido Island and sent a large number of troops to land on Hokkaido Island also spread to Dongjing. Lieutenant General Teraki Masaki, Minister of the Army, and General Anyun, Chief of Staff of the Army and Commander of the Manchurian Army, were furious on the spot when they heard the news. In their view, the Russians are simply deceiving people too much. Not only did they annihilate such a huge ground force, but they also directly launched an attack on the mainland of the Eastern Empire. This is simply to further intensify the conflict between the two sides. Damn the Russians, they are really bastards. Are they going to fight the Empire forever? General Anyun said through gritted teeth. We have no choice but to fight the Russians desperately. Otherwise, the Russians will definitely make an inch and make the Empire pay a greater price. Lieutenant General Genji's eyes filled with rage. Chapter 235, Death Reinforcement, 5th Update, please subscribe. Oriental Empire, Winter Palace, Imperial Palace. Mingzi Tianhuang's application was somewhat sluggish, but he still insisted on holding the imperial meeting. Mingzi Tianhuang discovered that since the war with the Tsarist Empire, the frequency of his imperial meetings had increased a lot. In the past, there were at most 2 or 3 imperial meetings throughout the year. The government affairs of the country are handled by the cabinet. But now, he has to hold an imperial meeting every 3 days. This made Mingzi Tianhuang very tired. In addition, his body is getting worse and worse, so his energy is not as good as before. If possible, he didn't want to take care of so many things, he wanted to recuperate with peace of mind. Advertisement. But the point is, the current situation is so tense, he can't settle down at all. Originally, the Eastern Empire had already suffered a crushing defeat in this battle, and Mingzi Tianhuang was very annoyed by the 370. But now, the Russians have gone so far as to attack their homeland, which is simply deceiving people too much. In other words, the bottom line of the Eastern Ocean Empire has been touched, and the Eastern Ocean Empire has no way to retreat. Your Majesty Tianhuang, the current situation is very tense for the Empire. The population of Hokkaido is very small, only about 1 million. In view of this, we only mobilized 2 infantry divisions on Hokkaido Island, that's all. Unexpectedly, this has become a loophole in the Empire's homeland defense, and was caught by the Russians. Now, the Russians are launching a massive attack on Hokkaido Island. The war situation is very unfavorable for the Empire. Prime Minister Katsura the general reported with a dark face. He never imagined that since he became Prime Minister, there will be so many broken things. Originally, he thought that he could lead the Eastern Empire to defeat the Tsarist Russian Empire and realize the rise of the Eastern Empire. In this case, his prestige will be greatly enhanced. But now I know that he has caught up with all the bad things. Mingzi Tianhuang's face was also ashen, although he was very angry in his heart, he had already lost his temper. But now, it is no longer time to pursue responsibility, but to find a way to solve the current predicament. Advertisement. Then, gentlemen, what should be done to ensure the safety of the Empire's homeland, and to drive the Russians away from Hokkaido Island? Or in other words, to keep Hokkaido Island? Mingzi Tianhuang asked. Although Hokkaido Island is sparsely populated, it is also the second largest island in the Eastern Empire. The Eastern Empire, whose land area was originally small, attached great importance to this island. Even, they are ready to vigorously develop Hokkaido Island, making it the most important production base of grain and other agricultural products in the Eastern Empire. Once the Russians snatch Hokkaido Island, it will definitely be a devastating blow to the Eastern Empire. Your Majesty Tian Huang, the Russians have blocked the Tsugaru Strait, and even blocked all the surrounding waters in the south of Hokkaido Island. Even if we want to reinforce Hokkaido Island, we can't do it. And the 66th Infantry of Hokkaido Island, as far as the division and the 67th Division are concerned, under the siege of the Russian superior forces, I am afraid they will not be able to withstand the siege for a long time. If there is no reinforcement, I am afraid that Hokkaido Island will fall soon. Minister of the Army Lieutenant General Masatake Teraka said. Your Majesty Tian Huang, we have ordered the 66th and 67th Infantry Divisions to do their best to resist the Russian attack. However, it is very difficult to say whether they can hold on. General Deshanyan also said. The Russians cannot be allowed to occupy Hokkaido Island. Otherwise, once they are swallowed up by the greedy Russians, it will be impossible for the Russians to spit it out again. Mingzi Tianhuang gritted his teeth and said. The Russians are very greedy for land. Otherwise, it would be impossible to develop from a small Grand Duchy of Moscow to the country with the largest territory in the world. Mingzi Tianhuang naturally didn't want the Russians to occupy Hokkaido Island and then throw it away completely. No matter what, we must find a way to reinforce Hokkaido Island. The Russians must not be allowed to occupy Hokkaido Island. No matter how high the price is, they will not hesitate. Mingzi Tianhuang continued. Your Majesty Tianhuang, we can send transport ships, or small boats, or even fishing boats, to transport troops to Hokkaido Island at night. However, it is very difficult to say whether it will be effective. Moreover, we must be attacked by the Russians. Intercepting, you will definitely pay a huge price on the road. 0. General Deshanyan bit the bullet and said. After Mingzi Tianhuang had issued such an order, General Deshanyan had no choice but to come up with a solution. However, this is bound to be a very expensive solution. I don't know how many ships will be sunk by the Russian Navy on the way, and how many Japanese soldiers will be drowned. Advertisement. But at this moment, they have no other way, they can only do this. Mingzi Tianhuang nodded, but this alone is obviously not enough, and other methods need to be thought of. Gentlemen, is there any other way? Mingzi Tianhuang asked. Your Majesty, we can only ask for help from the people on whom the sun never sets. They have promised before that they can ensure the safety of our homeland. But now, the Russians have directly attacked our homeland. Reasonably, the sun never sets, the fallen should also help us. If they can force the Russians to give up the island of Hokkaido, that would be the best. At worst, I hope they can ensure the safety of the Tsugaru Strait so that the Imperial Army can transport troops to the island of Hokkaido. In this case, we can continue to fight the Russians. Lieutenant General Teraka Masaki, the Minister of War, suggested. This is a way. Contact the sun never falls again, and the day never falls to help us. Mingzi Tianhuang said. Hi, Your Majesty. Foreign Minister Judaro Komura replied. In the face of the Russian attack on the mainland of the Eastern Empire on April 8, the Eastern Empire was shaken throughout the country. There are Oriental people holding parades everywhere, demanding that the Russians be driven out of the territory of the Oriental Empire. To this end, the Eastern Army also took action. On the night of September 4, the 65th Division of the Toyo Army Infantry mobilized 2 infantry regiments, more than 7,000 people, on board hundreds of ships, large and small, in an attempt to forcibly break through the blockade of the Russian army and cross the Tsugaru Strait. Land on Hokkaido Island and reinforce the defenders on the island. However, they were attacked by the largest warships of the Tsarist Russian Navy. As a result, most of the ships were sunk, and the 2 infantry regiments finally landed on Hokkaido Island with less than 500 people. The rest died in the strait. Chapter 236 Overlord is not easy to be. First update, please subscribe. Boom boom boom. In the Tsugaru Strait, a strait with a length of only over 100 kilometers and a width of only 20 to 50 kilometers, fierce battles are erupting. The local fleet of the Tsarist Russian Navy dispatched 6 Rostov-class light cruisers and 12 A-class destroyers to block the strait at night to prevent the Japanese from reinforcing Hokkaido Island. Other warships of the Tsarist Russian Navy's home fleet, such as the Mikhaili-class battleship and the Mosk-class heavy cruiser, had already withdrawn from the strait before it was dark. After all, the strait is very narrow, and once the line of sight is blocked at night, it is easy to be attacked by the enemy. Advertisement. Although the Eastern Navy has almost been wiped out, there are still some destroyers, as well as many gunboats and torpedo boats. These destroyers, gunboats, and torpedo boats were small though. However, once approached by them, it would also pose a huge threat to the large warships of the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy. Especially the torpedoes carried by the torpedo boats, even the Tsarist Russian Navy's Mikhaili-class battleships, do not want to be hit. Once hit, even if it won't be sunk, it will definitely be severely damaged. This will be very unfavorable for the subsequent operations of the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy. 03 In contrast, light cruisers and destroyers have smaller tonnage and faster speed, and are not easy to be hit even at night. Especially those A-class destroyers, the cost is relatively low. Even if it is lost, the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy will not be too distressed. It is relatively easy to replenish this type of warship. But for those Orientals, these light warships are enough to kill them. Those transport ships, merchant ships, and even fishing boats are no match for these light cruisers and destroyers at all, no matter whether it is the main gun, the secondary gun, or the rapid-fire gun. These ships can be easily sunk. The soldiers of the Eastern Army on board were undoubtedly completely powerless at this time. Even if they are extremely brave on land. But at this moment, they are like lambs waiting to be slaughtered. One after another, the ships of the Orientals were sunk, and they were even directly hit and sunk by warships of the Tsarist Russian Navy. A large number of Orientals fell into the water. Even though it's only September, the weather is still relatively hot. However, the sea water is icy cold. After the Orientals fell into the sea, they would freeze to death, or freeze to death and drown in a short time, becoming the shark's supper in the sea. These Orientals are looking for death. However, their behavior is very good. In the straits, the more Orientals die, the less trouble they can cause us. In Rostov on the light cruiser, Rear Admiral Inquist, Chief of Staff of the Black Sea Fleet, had a smile on his face. Advertisement. As the enemy of the Orientals, the Tsarist Russian Empire naturally wished that the more Orientals died, the better. Even if this war is over, the Eastern Empire and the Tsarist Russian Empire are also enemies. Therefore, the greater the loss of the Orientals in this war, the more beneficial it is to the Tsarist Russian Empire. In order to fully suppress the Orientals in the future, the Tsarist Russian Empire also hopes to do its best to weaken the strength of the Eastern Empire in this battle. After a night of fighting, most of the Japanese ships were sunk. Throughout the Tsugaru Strait, the bodies of Orientals are everywhere. Only a very small number of Orientals successfully crossed the Tsugaru Strait and landed on Hokkaido Island. However, what they faced was the powerful firepower of the Tsarist Russian army. There are very few who can really play a role in this war. During the daytime the next day, the Dongyang people took the initiative to stop this kind of death-seeking action. Because during the day, the capital ship of the Tsarist Russian Navy entered the Tsugaru Strait. At this time, if the Orientals dare to continue dispatching ships to cross the strait, they are really looking for death. The main gun of the battleship can destroy their ships with one shot. No matter how many Japanese troops there are, they can't afford such consumption. The next night, the Orientals once again strengthened the Tsugaru Strait and reinforced Hokkaido Island. This time, the same 2 infantry regiments were dispatched. But unfortunately, under the interception of the fleet of the Tsarist Russian Navy, most of the Orientals died in the strait, and only a very small number of Orientals successfully crossed the Tsugaru Strait and landed on Hokkaido Island. There are 4 infantry regiments under the jurisdiction of an infantry division, a total of 12 infantry brigades, and the one who finally crosses the strait is only equivalent to 1 infantry brigade. It is conceivable how big such a loss is. If this continues, even if all the remaining 31 infantry divisions of the Eastern Army are invested, only a very small number of Easterners will be able to successfully cross the Tsugaru Strait in the end. But what use could this be? Advertisement. After a few days in a row, because the loss was too great. This made the Dongyang army have to stop this behavior of sending to death. At the same time, the Russian army's war in Hokkaido Island also went very smoothly. The 66th Division and the 67th Division of the Eastern Army Infantry, although they have been stubbornly resisting. However, after the 4 infantry divisions and 1 marine brigade of the Russian army successfully landed, they all have absolute advantages in terms of military strength and firepower. The 2 infantry divisions of the Orientals are not opponents of the Russian army at all. If it weren't for the rugged terrain of Hokkaido Island and the many mountains 493 their car would have been knocked down. Even so, they couldn't last much longer. In a short time, the Russian army will be able to completely occupy the entire island of Hokkaido. Under such circumstances, the Orientals can only pin all their hopes on the people who never set the sun, hoping that the people who never set the sun can help them uphold justice. And now, the empire on which the sun never sets is also very troubled by the current situation. They also did not expect that this war would evolve into this way. Originally, they thought that with their support, the Eastern Empire would have a great chance of winning. Even if you fail, you won't lose too badly. However, the powerful strength displayed by the Tsarist Russian Empire in this battle far exceeded their expectations. So much so that the Orientals lost a complete defeat in this battle. Not only that, the Tsarist Russian Empire did not give the empire the sun never sets, and wanted to severely damage the Eastern Empire. This undoubtedly directly caused the overall strategy of the empire on which the sun never sets to be greatly challenged. If it were 100 years ago, or a few decades ago, the people who never set the sun would have gone to war against the Tsarist Empire. But the problem is that the empire on which the sun never sets has so many potential opponents that the empire on which the sun never sets dare not act rashly. Chapter 237 The Efforts of People Who Never Set in the Sun, second update, please subscribe. Damn Russians, what do they want to do? Could it be that they still want to truly destroy the Eastern Empire? Their appetite is too big. Prime Minister Arthur Bell was furious. The current situation in the Far East is so bad that Prime Minister Arthur Bell is very annoyed by the current situation. If possible, he certainly wants to find a way to change the current situation. But the current situation made him feel helpless. Your Excellency, the Russians directly landed on the mainland of the Eastern Empire to launch an attack, which is indeed beyond our expectations. However, if the Russians want to destroy the Eastern Empire, it is not realistic. Advertisement. After all, although the Eastern Empire was destroyed by the Russians, it was defeated. However, the strength is not considered weak, and there are still tens of millions of people. Besides, the island the Russians chose to land on was Hokkaido Island, not Honshu Island, the core and most populous of the Orientals. It can be seen from this that the Russians are also avoiding a larger-scale war with the Orientals. The Russians now have command of the sea, and whether the Japanese have deployed many troops on the island of Hokkaido. Therefore, they only need to invest a small amount of troops to control Hokkaido Island. Army Secretary Arnold Foster made his point. But the Russians attacked Hokkaido Island, which undoubtedly further expanded the scale of this war. Whether the previous wars were fought on the Koryo Peninsula or the Liaodong Peninsula, they did not involve the territories of the Tsarist Russian Empire and the Eastern Empire. But now, the flames of war have reached the homeland of the Orientals. Then, the nature of this war has changed. The Orientals will bow their heads and compromise. Foreign Secretary Fitzmaurice said. After hearing this, Prime Minister Arthur Bell frowned even more tightly. The Orientals now undoubtedly hate the Russians very much. However, I am afraid it is still very difficult for them to deal with the Russian attack. It is already doomed that Hokkaido Island will fall into the hands of the Russians. However, the attack on the Eastern Empire is probably more than that. Even if the Russians will no longer send troops to attack the hinterland of the Eastern Empire, or the core area with a large population. But don't forget that the coastline of the Eastern Empire is very tortuous. The navy of the Tsarist Russian Empire can completely cover the army and land in various parts of the Eastern Empire at will. In fact, the Russians don't even need to land, and they can just send out the navy to attack the coastal cities of the Orientals. You know, the main population of the Eastern Empire is almost they all live by the sea. Once these cities are bombarded by the Russians, it will inevitably cause greater losses to the Orientals. Lord Walter Kerr, the Secretary of the Navy, reminded. There is also a very important point. Like the Empire, the Eastern Empire relies heavily on overseas trade. Once the Russians use their fleet to cut off the overseas trade lines of the Eastern people, will the Eastern people be able to carry it? At that time, they may, even if you don't have enough to eat, let alone continue to fight the Russians. Chancellor of the Exchequer Austen Chamberlain reminded. Prime Minister Arthur Bell also showed a helpless expression on his face. In his opinion, under such circumstances, the Orientals seem to be dead. Gentlemen, it seems that we have no way to save the Orientals. Prime Minister Arthur Bell said. Advertisement. Your Excellency, Prime Minister, unless the Imperial Navy personally participates in the war and defeats the Russian Navy in one fell swoop. In that case, the crisis for the Orientals will be resolved. However, it will be very detrimental to the Empire, said Lord Walter Kerr. Prime Minister Arthur Bell still shook his head stubbornly. It is impossible for the Empire to go to war against the Russians at this time. Other powers, especially those ambitious and wanting to replace the Empire's hegemony, may wish us to break out with the Russians. Let's fight. Yes, Your Excellency the Prime Minister. The other ministers nodded one after another. Don't look at the fact that the empire on which the sun never sets is still the world's hegemon. However, there are many potential competitors. And one is stronger than the other. Even if the empire on which the sun never sets is the hegemon of the world, it has to be handled with care. In addition, it is not yet time to go all out, and the empire on which the sun never sets naturally does not want to get too involved in a war with a certain powerful country. In that case, it will only make other powerful national music bloom. It would be great if we could attract other powerful countries, such as the Germans, the Lighthouse Kingdom, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and even Gaul, to besiege the Russians together. In this way, we can defeat the Russians very quickly. Army Secretary Arnold Foster said. The army is the shortcoming of the empire on which the sun never sets, but the rest of the countries have huge armies. If they dispatched the army and the empire on which the sun never sets dispatched the navy, it would be easy enough to deal with the Russian Empire. But sadly, this can only be thought about. Even if the empire on which the sun never sets is the hegemon of the world, it is impossible for those countries to obey the orders of the empire on which the sun never sets. What's more, they wished that the empire on which the sun never sets took the lead in the war with the Tsarist Empire, and suffered heavy losses in the war. In that case, they will have the opportunity to replace the empire on which the sun never sets and become the new overlord. In any case, this war must end as soon as possible. We need to show a tougher attitude and make the Russians aware of our attitude. Only in this way can they be restrained a little. Only then can the Eastern Empire preserve its strength to the maximum extent. Good Zhao, said Colonial Secretary Alfred Littleton. That's right, we want to keep the Orientals as much as possible. They are a good pawn. St. John Broderick, Minister of Indian Affairs, also echoed Dao Feng. Prime Minister Arthur Bell thought for a while, and then said, well, order the Far East Fleet to enter the waters near the Eastern Empire to prevent the Russians from attacking other territories of the Eastern Empire. Let alone allow the Russians to cut off the maritime trade lines of the Eastern Empire. If necessary, the merchant ships of the Empire can be used to transport supplies for the Orientals. In addition, through other diplomatic means, warn the Russians. Let the Russians return to the negotiating table. End this war as much as possible. Your Excellency, why don't I go to Moscow myself? Foreign Secretary Fitzmaurice suggested. That's a good idea. Prime Minister Arthur Bell readily agreed. Chapter 238, Saving the Orientals, third update, please subscribe. Tsarist Russian Empire, Far East, Vladivostok. Tsar Mikhail is already preparing to board a special train and return to Moscow. At present, the war between the Tsarist Russian Empire and the Eastern Empire is not over yet. However, the Tsarist Russian Empire has already occupied an absolute advantage in this war. The battle between the Tsarist Russian Army and the Marine Corps on the island of Hokkaido also went very smoothly. In a short time, Hokkaido Island will be able to be occupied. Advertisement. The Japanese Navy has been completely annihilated, and it is impossible to reinforce the army to Hokkaido Island when the command of the sea is already in the hands of the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy. Under such circumstances, naturally, we can only watch Hokkaido Island fall into the hands of the Tsarist Russian Empire. Of course, because of the strength of the Tsugaru Strait and the reinforcement of Hokkaido Island, the Toyo army has lost tens of thousands of elite troops. Such a huge loss made them dare not try anymore. I'm afraid that if they throw all their family property here, once the Tsarist Russian army attacks other areas of the Eastern Empire, they will have no way to resist it. The Eastern army on the island of Hokkaido can only let them fend for themselves. Not only that, after resting and reorganizing the main force of the Tsarist Russian army, it has already invested in the attack on the Koryo Peninsula. The first army of the Dongyang 253 army is also doomed to escape. Moreover, they not only cut off their retreat, but also cut off their supply lines. It won't be long before the Koryo Peninsula will fall back under the control of the Russian Empire. And the fate of the first army of the Eastern Army can be imagined naturally. Under such circumstances, there is no need for Mikhail to stay in Vladivostok. However, the Chief of General Staff, General Brusilov, will continue to stay and take full responsibility for the command of military operations. Until the army and navy of the Tsarist Russian Empire won this war. Your Excellency, Chief of Staff, I will leave the battle on the front line to you. I will return to Moscow first. Mikhail said. Okay, Your Majesty. At present, there are no troubles for the Orientals. The Imperial Army and Navy will definitely win this battle. Your Majesty just needs to wait for our good news in Moscow. Bruskilo General Husband seemed very confident. Of course, in the case that the Tsarist Russian Army and Navy already have an absolute advantage, if they still lose this battle, then they, the top military officials, will simply commit suicide one by one. The foreign minister, whose sun never sets, is estimated to be arriving in Moscow soon. Next, we will mainly resolve this war through peaceful negotiations. It is impossible for us to truly destroy the Orientals through this battle. Therefore, the main thing is negotiations. Yes. The Imperial Army and Navy have an absolute advantage on the battlefield, which will give us a great advantage in negotiations. Mikhail said. Advertisement. Admiral Brusilov nodded again and again, Your Majesty, the sun never sets and no one has spared no effort to save the Orientals. Haha. That's right, the people who never set the sun really want to save the Dongyang people. Then, we can take advantage of this opportunity to weaken the people who never set the sun. So as to prepare for the empire to replace the people who never set the sun in the future. Mikhail laughed. If the sun never sets to save the Orientals, then they have to pay the price. The greater the price paid by those who never set the sun, the greater their strength will be weakened. In this case, the gap in strength between the Tsarist Russian Empire and the empire on which the sun never sets will continue to narrow. Maybe, in the next world war, the sun never sets and the national strength will further decline, or even collapse. At that time, it will be even easier for the Tsarist Russian Empire to replace the hegemony of the empire on which the sun never sets. Admiral Brusilov was naturally very clear about His Majesty's mind. Okay, the next battle is up to you, and I will keep in touch with you at any time. Sea Hail said. Yes, Your Majesty. I wish you a smooth journey. Admiral Brusilov said. Adsib. Woo. Woo. The train whistle sounded. Boom boom boom. Soon, the special train began to gallop up. This time, in addition to adding water and coal, there will be no additional stops along the way. All other trains will also give way to the special train of His Majesty the Tsar. In this case, Mikhail will be able to return to Moscow in less than 10 days. Because the Tsarist Russian Navy has gained control of the sea, a large amount of supplies can be transported by sea. This makes the Trans-Siberian Railway a lot less stressful. Advertisement. While Mikhail's special train was still speeding on the Siberian Railway, the Foreign Minister of the Empire of the Sun Never Sets, Fitzmaurice, had already arrived in Moscow. In order to show respect, Izversky, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Tsarist Russian Empire, personally greeted him at the train station. In addition, the immediate boss came, and Sullivan, the ambassador of the empire on which the sun never sets to the Russian Empire, also rushed to the train station. After some brief pleasantries, Fitzmaurice stayed at the hotel in Moscow. Yasuya Uchida, the minister of the Eastern Empire to the Tsarist Russian Empire, hurried to the hotel to pay a visit to Philip Morris. The current Oriental Empire has lost its temper after being beaten in the war, so it is natural to want to beg the empire on which the sun never sets to help them and rescue them. They hope that during the negotiations, the empire on which the sun never sets can show its support for the Eastern Empire as much as possible, so that the Eastern Empire can pay as little price as possible. Your Excellency, the empire on which the sun never sets will fully support the Eastern Empire in the upcoming negotiations. However, your performance on the battlefield is too bad. Therefore, you must be prepared, and you will definitely pay a certain price. Only then can the Russians love it. Morris reminded for the first time. Your Excellency, we are very aware of this. However, the empire's finances and economy are already facing collapse. And the Russians have such a big appetite, we simply cannot afford huge war reparations. Uchida Yasuya began to cry poorly. On the issue of war reparations, we will try our best to make the Russians make concessions. As for the payment method, we will also help you find a way. The empire will not just watch the Eastern Empire collapse. Fitzmaurice promised. Uchida Yasuya could not help but breathe a sigh of relief when he heard what Fitzmaurice said. As long as the empire on which the sun never sets is willing to really give them a hand, the situation will probably not be so bad. The Eastern Empire would not really be hit hard by the Russians. Even if you pay a huge price in this negotiation. But at least they have a chance to rise again. Chapter 239, The Threat That the Sun Never Sets, 4th, please subscribe. On the morning of September 18, 1804, in the conference room of the hotel where the foreign minister of the empire on which the sun never sets, Fitzmaurice, stayed, the third round of peace negotiations between the Tsarist Russian Empire and the Eastern Empire began again. Although, the countries involved in this war were the Tsarist Russian Empire and the Eastern Empire. However, as a mediator, the empire on which the sun never sets has clearly stood on the side of the Orientals. Your Excellency, the empire on which the sun never sets cannot allow the Tsarist Russian Empire to launch an attack on the mainland of the Eastern Empire. This not only severely damages the peace, but also plunges the Far East and the whole world into turmoil, which seriously threatens the interests of the empire. We hope that the war between the Tsarist Russian Empire and the Eastern Empire can end as soon as possible. Advertisement. Fitzmaurice unabashedly expressed the attitude of the empire on which the sun never sets. Your Excellency, this war is a war between the empire and the Oriental Empire. And this war was initiated by the Orientals first. Is the Ubuka Empire going to intervene in this war? The Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Tsarist Russian Empire Izversky asked. The empire on which the sun never sets does not want to intervene in this war. However, the Eastern Empire is an important ally of the empire. We must not allow the Eastern Empire to be invaded by the Tsarist Russian Empire and be severely damaged by the Tsarist Russian Empire. You should not challenge the bottom line of the empire. Once if you push the empire to a dead end, then you should be very clear about the consequences. Even though the Tsarist Russian Empire has grown very powerful over the years, the empire can still make the Tsarist Russian Empire pay the price. Fitzmaurice directly threatened. Isiversky's face was very ugly, but he had to admit that the threat that the sun never sets is still very effective. The strength of the Royal Navy of the empire on which the sun never sets is number one in the world. The Imperial Navy of Tsarist Russia cannot be compared with the Royal Navy of the empire on which the sun never sets. Of course, it is impossible for the Bulow Empire to pose much threat to the mainland of the Tsarist Russian Empire. Unless the empire on which the sun never sets can unite a large number of other countries to encircle and suppress the Tsarist Russian Empire. Yes, under the current situation, the Tsarist Russian Empire wants to go to war with the Japanese Empire. In that case, it will only be cheaper for other countries. Even if the Tsarist Russian Empire really wanted to defeat the empire on which the sun never sets and replace the empire on which the sun never sets as the new overlord. However, if this allows other powerful countries to take advantage of it, then, the Tsarist Russian Empire will naturally not take chestnuts from the fire for other powerful countries. Well, we agree to end this war. However, the Eastern Empire must accept the conditions proposed by the Empire. First, the Eastern Empire compensates the Empire with a war indemnity of 2 billion rubles. Second, the Eastern Empire recognizes that the Koryo Peninsula is part of the Empire. The sphere of influence must not be infiltrated and expanded to the Koryo Peninsula by any means. Third, cede Hokkaido Island to the Empire. Izversky issued a series of conditions. Advertisement. Unlike the previous conditions put forward by the Tsarist Russian Empire, this time the Tsarist Russian Empire did not ask the troops of the Eastern Empire to surrender. After all, the troops dispatched by the Eastern Empire to the Koryo Peninsula and the Liaodong Peninsula have already lost almost all of their losses, and will soon be completely wiped out by the Tsarist Russian Empire. However, it added a territorial claim to the island of Hokkaido. No, Hokkaido Island is the inherent territory of the Empire, and it is absolutely impossible for us to cede it to the Tsarist Empire. Yasuya Uchida, the minister of the Eastern Empire to the Tsarist Empire, immediately objected. The island of Hokkaido is already under the control of the Empire, and the Empire will not let it out. Besides, the island of Hokkaido is not an inherent territory of the Eastern Empire. It originally belonged to the Ezo country, but the Ezo country was taken over by you. Just perished, retorted Izversky. Uchida Yasuya certainly cannot accept such an explanation. Although Hokkaido Island is sparsely populated, it has become the most important agricultural product production area in the Eastern Empire. If it is lost, this will cause a bigger gap in the food supply of the Eastern Empire. At the same time, the geographical location of Hokkaido Island is also very important. Once the Russians occupy here, they can directly pose a greater threat to the Eastern Empire. However, how could it be possible to spit out the fat that had been eaten by the Tsarist Russian Empire? On this issue, Inada Yasuya's attitude is also very firm. The conditions put forward by the Russian Empire this time are indeed too harsh. If this is the case, it is not conducive to this negotiation, and it is even more detrimental to the end of this war. The Russian Empire should make some concessions. Fitzmaurice said. 0. Asking for flowers. Your Excellency, we have made a lot of concessions. Before, the war indemnity we asked for was 3 billion rubles, but we have already made concessions to 2 billion rubles. Moreover, we asked the Eastern Empire army to lay down its weapons and surrender. Now, we have achieved this goal through military operations. In this process, we have paid a considerable price. Izversky retorted. Subsequently, the two sides once again launched a fierce confrontation on this issue. Advertisement. Fitzmaurice even threatened if the Tsarist Empire still refused to back down. Then, the empire on which the sun never sets will take more direct action. The day never sets, the Royal Navy of the Empire will go all out to ensure the safety of the lighthouse country. Even, control the Tsugaru Strait. 0. Izversky's complexion suddenly became very ugly. The sun never sets, this is a threat to the Tsarist Empire. Once the sun never sets, people control the Tsugaru Strait. Then, wouldn't the man who never sets the sun help the Eastern Empire army to continuously transport reinforcements to the island of Hokkaido? In that case, the Tsarist Russian Empire may have to fall into a bitter battle on Hokkaido Island. In order to defend their territory, the Orientals will naturally go all out and fight the Tsarist Russian Empire desperately. But the Tsarist Russian Empire tried its best to avoid such a situation from happening. Otherwise, once it falls into a protracted war, it will be very unfavorable to the Tsarist Russian Empire. On the contrary, people on whom the sun never sets should wish for that to happen. In that case, they can realize the purpose of using Orientals to consume the Tsarist Russian Empire. This war has lasted for more than half a year. Even if the Tsarist Russian Empire is about to win this war. However, the Tsarist Russian Empire also paid a lot in this war. Especially in terms of material consumption, too many resources have been consumed. If the war continues, the pressure on the Russian Empire will be even greater. However, the direct intervention in the war by the man on whom the sun never sets still made the Tsarist Russian Empire very dissatisfied. This is even more likely to cause a war between the two sides. Chapter 240 Blocking the Eastern Empire, 5th update, please subscribe. Minister, does the empire on which the sun never sets want to start a full-scale war with the empire? You have already intervened in the war by sending a fleet to help the Orientals. It's just that the empire is for the sake of peace and to avoid further intensification of conflicts. Therefore, no further action was taken. You know, the empire is in the Far East, but it has imprisoned tens of thousands of sailors from the Royal Navy. Izversky said coldly. Advertisement. No, Your Excellency, the empire has no intention of intervening in this war. The fleet that participated in the war before was not the Royal Navy, but a fleet hired by the Eastern Empire. We sold a batch of warships to Eastern Ocean before the war. It's an empire. It's just that the Eastern Empire doesn't have so many sailors to drive these ships. That's why they hired a group of sailors from the Royal Navy. This is the same as the September 17th of the Royal Navy and the empire on which the sun never sets. It doesn't matter at all. Fitzmaurice immediately pushed the blame completely. Humph. Your Excellency, do you think we will believe this explanation? Izversky snorted coldly. Your Excellency, the important thing is not whether you believe it or not, but whether the empire thinks so. Fitzmaurice said bluntly. Indeed, in this day and age, truth is only within the range of a cannon. The empire on which the sun never sets has a powerful force, and they simply don't care what other countries think. Then, Your Excellency, if the empire is unwilling to compromise and make concessions, then, will the empire directly intervene in this war during these 10 times? Siversky asked. Of course not. However, the empire will take all means to safeguard the interests of the empire. Fitzmaurice replied. Fitzmaurice kept claiming that he would not directly intervene in the war. However, the meaning revealed from his words is already very obvious. That is, everything is in the interests of the empire on which the sun never sets. Minister, if our two countries go to war, it will definitely not benefit the empire on which the sun never sets. Of course, our navy is not your opponent. However, the empire on which the sun never sets cannot threaten the empire from land. On the contrary, the empire can send out the army to launch an attack on the important colonies of the Yabulo Empire. Yizefyoshi even warned. Your Excellency, it is indeed as you said. However, we are not unprepared. At present, the main force of the Tsarist Russian Empire is in the Far East. How many troops can be dispatched to attack the empire's colonies? What's more, the empire is in an important position. The colonies have also deployed a large number of troops. Even if there is a war, the empire may not lose. Fitzmaurice replied tit for tat. Advertisement. For a moment, the atmosphere in the conference room became tense. Uchida Yasuya, Minister of the East, was very happy. If the sun never sets, the empire and the Tsarist Empire would really go to war. Then, maybe they can usher in a turning point. The most powerful thing in the empire on which the sun never sets is the navy. How about the Ministry of War? However, the Eastern Empire can make up for this shortcoming with its powerful army. Maybe, if they try their best, they can really defeat the Russian Empire. After a brief confrontation, the Tsarist Russian Empire knew very well that this time the attitude of the sun never sets is very firm. In order to avoid contradicting further plans, the Tsarist Empire chose to make some slight concessions. Well, Your Excellency, the empire can make concessions again. However, this is already the bottom line of the empire. Other conditions remain unchanged, and the Eastern Empire only needs to pay 1.5 billion rubles in war reparations. If the Eastern Empire still refuses to accept if this condition is met, then, I think we don't need to waste any more time. Even if the empire on which the sun never sets wants to go to war with the empire, it's not a big deal. At most, we'll both lose. Izversky made after making certain concessions, his attitude became firmer. Yasuya Uchida looked at Fitzmaurice. If possible, he certainly didn't want to accept such a condition. For the Eastern Empire, such conditions are still very harsh. Most importantly, Hokkaido Island has not been brought back yet. Fitzmaurice frowned, hesitated for a while, and said, the war reparation has been reduced to 1 billion rubles, and Hokkaido Island will be returned to the Eastern Empire. Siversky shook his head, rejecting the offer. This has brought the negotiations to an impasse again. Advertisement. Subsequently, the negotiations were temporarily suspended, so as not to cause fierce quarrels and cause the negotiations to break down. Unless it is absolutely necessary, neither the empire on which the sun never sets nor the Tsarist Russian Empire really wants to go to war with each other. Mikhail, who was still on the special train, had the same dignified expression after receiving Izversky's telegram. He doesn't want to start a war with the empire on which the sun never sets now, but also wants to let the Germans weaken the strength of the empire on which the sun never sets in the next war. It would be too cheap for the Germans to go to war with the empire on which the sun never sets. Send a telegram to the Home Fleet and the Pacific Fleet, asking them to dispatch the fleet to block the mainland of the Eastern Empire. Mikhail issued an order. The Eastern Empire is a country that relies heavily on overseas trade. If the sea transportation line is cut off, well, this will be an extremely heavy blow to them. After all, they cannot even be self-sufficient in food supply. Once it is blocked, food prices will inevitably skyrocket, and many people will be starved. Even, this will further aggravate the social contradictions of the Eastern Empire, making it even more difficult for the Eastern Empire to persist in this battle. Your Majesty, if the navy blocks the Eastern Empire, would that anger you? You can't fall into it. You don't fall into it, but you don't fall into it and send the fleet north. Lieutenant General Vesely, Director of Intelligence 4.4, was a little worried. Mikhail shook his head. With the strength of the current Far East Fleet, the sun never sets. I'm afraid it is not the opponent of the Imperial Navy. If they transfer fleets from other parts of the world, it will inevitably cause the sun never sets in other important sea areas. The army is empty. Don't forget, the enemy of the sun never sets is not only the Empire. Especially in Europe, the Germans are eyeing the sun never sets. They alone are enough to hold back nearly half of the sun never sets sea power. Yes, Your Majesty. Lieutenant General Vesely replied. After receiving Mikhail's order, the Tsarist Russian Navy's Home Fleet and Pacific Fleet immediately took action. After leaving a part of the warships to blockade the Tsugaru Strait, the rest of the fleet rushed towards the coastal waters of the Eastern Empire, intending to completely block the Eastern Empire. Chapter 241 Confrontation at Sea. First update, please subscribe. In order to break through the blockade of the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy on the Tsugaru Strait, the Orientals sent reinforcements to Hokkaido Island, and they did not hesitate to put the remaining destroyers, gunboats, and torpedo boats of the Eastern Imperial Navy into the battle. However, this caused them huge losses, and they were unable to break the blockade of the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy. So much so that the Eastern Empire can no longer send warships to break through the Tsugaru Strait. This also made the Russian Imperial Navy only need to leave 2 light cruisers and a few destroyers, which is enough to block the Tsugaru Strait. Coupled with the Battle of the Tsarist Russian Empire Army in Hokkaido Island, it has won a decisive victory. Advertisement. The main forces of the 66th and 67th Divisions of the Eastern Army Infantry have been wiped out, and only a very small number of troops have fled to the deep mountains and old forests to fight tenaciously. This will not have much impact on the Tsarist Russian Empire's control of Hokkaido Island. Under such circumstances, the Tsarist Russian Navy can already transfer the main fleet to carry out other combat missions. The coastline of the Eastern Empire is very long, and it is undoubtedly very difficult for the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy to completely block the entire Eastern Empire. Or rather, it simply cannot be done. Even if the Tsarist Russian Navy's local fleet and the Pacific Fleet 03 all add up, there are only dozens of warships. Compared with the long coastline of the Oriental Empire, this is nothing at all. Fortunately, these warships of the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy can sail continuously, and one warship can block a long section of coastline. In addition, the Tsarist Russian Navy can keep an eye on the large port cities of the Orientals and prevent the merchant ships of the Orientals from entering these ports. Then, even if the Eastern Empire cannot be completely blocked, at least most of the merchant ships of the Eastern Empire cannot enter the port. In this case, the blockade of the Eastern Empire was barely completed. Once the maritime transportation lines of the Eastern Empire were cut off, then, it will undoubtedly be very difficult for the Eastern Empire to continue to persevere. In order to ensure the success of this operation, the Tsarist Russian Navy also did its best. 6 Mikhail I-class battleships of the local fleet, 12 Mosk-class heavy cruisers, 14 of the 18 Rostov-class light cruisers, plus 20 A-class destroyers all into the blockade. Advertisement. At the same time, the 4 Ekaterina II-class battleships of the Pacific Fleet, the Navarin battleship, the captured 5 Sovereign-class battleships on which the sun never sets, as well as the Tsarist Russian Empire armored cruiser and the armored cruiser Rurik, the 6 Cressy-class armored cruisers and 1 Derrick-class armored cruiser that captured the sun never set, as well as several protected cruisers of the Pacific Fleet, were all thrown into the blockade. It can be said that the main fleet of the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy has all been put into the blockade. In terms of the current situation of the Eastern Empire, it is impossible to break the blockade of the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy. Of course, the enemy that the Tsarist Russian Imperial Navy really had to guard against was still the sun never set. However, at present, the Far East Fleet of the Imperial Navy, on which the sun never sets, only has 3 Sovereign-class battleships, 6 Duncan-class battleships, and 6 Old Man Star battleships that were urgently transferred from the Mediterranean Fleet, plus some armored and protected cruisers. Although the overall strength is good, compared with the current main fleet of the Tsarist Russian Navy, it does not have an advantage at all. No matter in terms of battleships, armored cruisers, and other warships, the Far East Fleet of the Imperial Navy on which the sun never sets alone cannot suppress the Tsarist Russian Navy at all. Unless the sun never sets, the Royal Navy of the Empire continues to deploy more warships from the Mediterranean Fleet and the local fleet for reinforcements. However, let's not talk about whether the Empire on which the sun never sets will make such a determination to reinforce the Far East despite the lack of strength in other sea areas. Even if the Empire on which the sun never sets really did so. However, this also takes a lot of time. At least until the arrival of reinforcements from which the sun never sets, the Far East Fleet, where the sun never sets, dare not act rashly. Once there is a conflict between the two sides, and even if the gun goes off, the sun never sets and no one will have the slightest chance of winning. If it is not done well, it will be severely injured. This means that for at least the next month, the Eastern Empire will be blocked, and the sea trade lines will also be cut off. They will pay a very heavy blow for this. Boom. Boom. After a large number of warships of the Tsarist Russian Navy appeared in the coastal waters of the Eastern Empire, they immediately launched an attack. All ships flying the flag of the Eastern Empire, whether they were merchant ships or cruise ships, or even fishing boats, were attacked. Advertisement. Either stop the ship immediately and be captured by the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy, or get sunk. For a time, the waters near the Eastern Empire were jittery. The maritime trade lines of the Eastern Empire are already facing the risk of being cut off. This is undoubtedly a devastating blow to the Eastern Empire. Damn Russians, they are going to put us to death. Prime Minister Guitaro cursed. Your Excellency Prime Minister, we must immediately ask for the help of the sun never sets. If we continue to be blocked by the Russians in this way, the consequences will be unimaginable. We have a large number of products that cannot be transported out. If we cannot deliver on time, it will only be liquidated damages. Is not a small amount. In addition to 523, a large amount of raw materials cannot be transported back to the mainland, which will force our industrial enterprises to stop production. At the same time, domestic grain cannot last much longer. The price of rice has been rising continuously. It is on the rise. If it continues like this, the people will definitely be very dissatisfied. Minister of Finance Son Aresuk reminded. General Guitaro nodded again and again, he was also aware of this problem. The Orientals, who were already unable to fight back against the Tsarist Russian Empire, could only ask for help from the sun never sets, hoping that the sun never sets could give them a hand at this critical moment. Contact the sun never sets immediately, we need them to ensure the safety of our sea transportation line. General Guitaro ordered. Hi, Your Excellency the Prime Minister. Naval Minister Gonbei Yamamoto replied. September 22, 1804 outside Winter Bay. The armored cruiser Rurik of the Tsarist Russian Navy, the armored cruiser Drake, which has already been captured, and 2 destroyers blocked the Uraga waterway entering and leaving Dongjing Bay, so that the merchant ships of the Orientals could not enter. At the same time, the fleet that never sets is blocked outside. The battleships Resolution, Revenge, and Royal Oak, which never set in the sun, and several protected cruisers, confronted the Tsarist Russian Navy. Chapter 242 The sword is on the verge of breaking out, the second update, please subscribe. Your Excellency, Captain, have we encountered the main fleet where the sun never sets? 3 battleships, and quite a few armored cruisers and protected cruisers. With our words alone, if we fight, I'm afraid we will suffer a lot. On the armored cruiser Rurik, a young officer couldn't help feeling a little worried. I have already sent a telegram to the flagship, and our reinforcements will arrive soon. The sun never sets, so we may not dare to do anything. Lieutenant Colonel Plovsky, the captain of the armored cruiser Rurik, looked very calm. With the strength of the people who never set the sun gathered outside Dongjing Bay, it is indeed very easy to defeat them. However, once the sun never sets, people really do this. Then, the Tsarist Russian Navy will never let it go. Next, the Tsarist Russian Navy will inevitably have a large number of warships to retaliate against the sun never sets. Advertisement. With the current strength of the Far East Fleet of the Imperial Navy, the sun never sets, it is simply impossible to defeat the main fleet of the Tsarist Russian Navy. Unless the sun never sets, the reinforcements of the Imperial Navy rush to the Far East from other sea areas. Otherwise, as long as the sun never sets and people's brains are not broken, they will not take action lightly. The sun never sets on the battleship Resolution of the Far East Fleet of the Imperial Navy, the commander of the fleet, Lieutenant General Frederick, and the Chief of Staff, Major General Karl Thorpe, are observing the warships of the Tsarist Russian Navy in the distance with binoculars. Your Excellency, the Russians only have 2 armored cruisers and 2 destroyers. If we forcefully launch an attack, we can easily defeat them. Rear Admiral Karl Thorpe said. Lieutenant General Frederick shook his head, you can't do it without authorization. If the gun is misfired, then we will have to break out a large-scale war with the Russians. The orders of the Cabinet and the Ministry of the Navy are very clear. You can provide support and help to the Orientals, but you can never really fight the Russians. Major General Karl Thorpe nodded, he also understood the current situation very well. Oh! Damn the Russians! The Empire would have crushed the Russians if the Germans hadn't been a growing threat to the Empire. Maybe those guys in the army are afraid of the Russians. But the Royal Navy eats the Russian Navy, there is still no problem at all. Major General Karl Thorpe was very disappointed. There is no other way. The military must always serve politics. Signal the Russians to get out of here and we are going to enter Winter Beam Bay. They have no right to block our channel. Lieutenant General Frederick ordered Road. Yes, Your Excellency. Major General Karl Thorpe replied. Advertisement. Afterwards, the man who never sets the sun contacted the Tsarist Russian Navy through semaphore and asked the Tsarist Russian Navy to leave and give up the channel. However, the reply they got was that this place already belongs to the war zone, and ships from other countries are not allowed to enter. Otherwise, do so at your own risk. This reply from the Tsarist Russian Navy made the sun never set people very dissatisfied. You know, the Royal Navy of the Empire on which the sun never sets is the overlord of the sea. They sail across the oceans all over the world, and there has never been anything they cannot enter. Lieutenant General Frederick and Major General Karl Thorpe wanted to order the fleet to forcibly break into the Uraga Channel. However, they found that the warships of the Tsarist Russian Navy had already aimed at them. If they dare to forcibly charge, the Tsarist Russian Navy will definitely open fire. Of course, with their strength, they are not afraid of the 2 armored cruisers of the Tsarist Russian Navy, which are enough to destroy them. However, they can't do this. Otherwise, a great war will break out because of this. At that time, they will not be able to bear this responsibility. At this time, reinforcements from the Tsarist Russian Navy arrived. 2 sovereign-class battleships seized from the Royal Navy on which the sun never sets, namely the Sovereign battleship and the Tianzhu Emperor battleship, appeared in this sea area. When the sun never sets, people are naturally extremely annoyed when they see these 2 battleships. This was once a battleship of the Royal Navy. Now, it has become a battleship of the Russians. Even if these warships have been sold to the Orientals by the sun never sets. However, being captured by the Russians is also a disgrace to the Royal Navy. Your Excellency, what should we do? Major General Karl Thorpe's face was very ugly. After the Russians added 2 more battleships, the strength gap between the 2 sides is no longer so much. If they forcibly attack, even if they succeed, they will pay a considerable price. Command the fleet, don't act rashly. Without my order, you can't do anything to irritate the Russians. Although Lieutenant General Frederick was very aggrieved, he was not overwhelmed by anger and still acted rationally. Choice. Advertisement. Yes, Your Excellency. Major General Karl Thorpe replied. However, just to be on the safe side, Lieutenant General Frederick also issued an order to request other warships of the Royal Navy's Far East Fleet to come for reinforcements. At the same time, the warships of the Tsarist Russian Navy also received orders to assemble outside the Beijing bays. All of a sudden, warships of the Tsarist Russian Navy and the Royal Navy of the Empire on which the sun never sets were gathering in this sea area. At night, the 6 Old Man Star battleships of the Imperial Navy on which the sun never sets also arrived. The number of battleships that made them assemble outside Dongjing Bay has reached 9. Similarly, for the Tsarist Russian Navy, 3 other sovereign-class battleships and 4 Ekaterina II-class battleships also rushed to the battlefield. The number of battleships on both sides has reached 9. However, judging from the performance of these battleships, the performance of the 9 battleships on which the sun never sets is a bit more advanced. After all, the performance of the 4 Ekaterina II-class battleships of the Tsarist Russian Navy is a bit crotch. But even if that was the case, the sun never sets and the man did not take the lead in attacking. Nor did they want to actually go to war with the Tsarist Russian Navy. The same is true for the Tsarist Russian Navy. They just want to block the Japanese, and they never thought of going to war with the Royal Navy of the Empire on which the sun never sets at this time. Therefore, although the 2 sides are in a confrontation, the performance is tense. However, he maintained restraint and did not let the situation further intensify. However, as time went by, more and more warships from both sides gathered outside Dongjing Bay. The battleship Navarin of the Pacific Fleet of the Tsarist Russian Navy also arrived. Even the local fleet of the Tsarist Russian Navy dispatched 2 Mikhail I-class battleships and 2 Mosk-class heavy cruisers for reinforcements. On the side of the Royal Navy where the sun never sets, the remaining 6 Duncan-class battleships also appeared in this sea area. Chapter 243 Breaking the Roots of the Oriental Navy. 3rd, please subscribe. Oriental Empire, Yokosuka Naval Base. The Prime Minister, Admiral Katsura Taro, and the Navy Minister, Lieutenant General Gonbei Yamamoto, all rushed here. Just outside the Uraga waterway not far away, a large number of warships of the Tsarist Russian Navy and the Royal Navy of the Imperial Navy on which the sun never sets are confronting each other. The whole scene was very tense, and there was a posture of wiping out the gun. And this also made the Orientals very anxious. They hoped that the Tsarist Russian Navy and the Royal Navy of the Empire on which the sun never sets could go off, and it would be best to fight. In this case, they may have a chance to come back. Haven't the Russians and the Sunbushi people fought yet? General Guitaro asked urgently. Advertisement. Lieutenant General Gonbei Yamamoto shook his head. There hasn't been a fight yet. Whether it's the Russians or the people who never set the sun, although they are on the verge of a sword. However, they have been restraining. Obviously, whether it is the Russians or the people who never set the sun, people don't want to really tear their faces apart. Damn it. It would be great if they could fight. God Amaterasu. Bless them to fight every 10 minutes. General Guitaro couldn't help praying to the god of failure. Standing on the standing ground of the Eastern Empire, it is natural to wish that the Russians would fight against the sun never sets. But now the 2 sides can't fight, which is undoubtedly very, very unfavorable for the Eastern Empire. Your Excellency Prime Minister, what should we do? Shall we dispatch warships to attack one side and provoke a war between the 2 sides? Lieutenant General Gonbei Yamamoto asked. If the Eastern Navy launches an attack at night, there is still a great possibility of provoking a war between the two sides. General Guitaro was a little moved. However, after thinking about it, I rejected this suggestion. Advertisement. No, we can't take risks. If someone catches us, the consequences will be serious. Not only the Russians will not let us go, but neither will the people who never set the sun. Luo Ren helped us at a critical moment. General Guitaro felt a little regretful. However, still not ready. The Tsarist Russian Navy and the Imperial Navy on which the sun never sets confront each other outside Windturking Bay. Although the two sides are at war with each other, there is no real sign of tearing their faces apart. This made the Orientals extremely disappointed. However, the Russian Navy's blockade, Adka, of the Eastern Empire gradually began to work. On the wharf of the Eastern Empire, a large amount of goods were piled up and could not be transported out. At the same time, there are still a large amount of raw materials that cannot be transported back to the mainland of the Eastern Empire. This is undoubtedly a devastating blow to the industry and commerce of the Eastern Empire. You must know that the Eastern Empire was originally a country with scarce domestic resources. They rely entirely on importing raw materials from abroad, then processing them into products, and selling them to foreign markets to earn the difference. Once the factory shuts down, the industry shuts down. For the Eastern Empire, the impact and blow caused are very great. The industry and economy of the entire Eastern Empire are rapidly deteriorating. If the blockade of the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy continues like this, I'm afraid it won't be long before the economy of the Eastern Empire will collapse. Another bigger problem is that all merchant ships transporting grain cannot return to the mainland of the Eastern Empire. As a result, the food consumption in the Eastern Empire began to increase continuously. They didn't have much food in reserve, and it could only last for 2 months. Once the food reserves are consumed, then, there will even be a famine in the Eastern Empire. At that time, I don't know how many Japanese people will starve to death. Even, it will cause very serious social problems, which will directly lead to further intensification of social contradictions in the Eastern Empire. In this process, the price of rice is also constantly rising. This made those tight-knit Orientals who had already passed by, even more unable to bear it. Many people eat their last meal without a second meal, and more people will be hungry. After returning to Moscow, Tsar Mikhail listened to the progress of the negotiations. After learning that the two sides have huge differences on the amount of war reparations and the issue of Hokkaido Island, and they can't reach an agreement at all, they don't care. Since there are big differences, let's keep procrastinating. Anyway, the Navy is blocking the Japanese. The longer the delay, the greater their losses, and the more beneficial it is to us. Mikhail didn't care. Advertisement. The Tsarist Russian Empire army has completely captured the island of Hokkaido. The last rebels on the island are being wiped out. The military operations of the Tsarist Russian army on the Koryo Peninsula were also very smooth. The First Army of the Eastern Army has suffered heavy losses, with extremely heavy losses. Even if they are still stubbornly resisting. But it seemed that he couldn't last much longer. In this case, time is undoubtedly on the side of the Russian Empire. Yes, Your Majesty. Foreign Minister Izversky naturally had no objection to this. The war is coming to an end. Then, the biggest purpose in this negotiation is to strive for as many benefits as possible for the Tsarist Russian Empire. At the same time, through the peace treaty, the interests that the Tsarist Russian Empire should obtain were solidified. Even if the treaty will be torn up in the future. However, at least the treaty existed, and it would also become the basis for the Russian Empire to launch a new war against the Orientals in the future. Suddenly, Mikhail had a flash of inspiration and thought of a way maybe we can further force the Orientals to admit defeat. General Alexander, send a telegram to the fleet to prepare for a raid. This time, we will cut off the route of the Eastern Navy. Mikhail ordered. Break the route of the Eastern Navy. Admiral Alexander, the Secretary of the Navy, was a little puzzled. You must know that in the South China Sea naval battle, the Navy of the Eastern Empire has almost been wiped out. Although we have already defeated the Dongyang Navy in naval battles. However, if there is money and warships, the Dongyang Navy will be able to recover its strength soon. The most important point is that the Dongyang Navy still has a lot of sailors, and a set of an effective training system for sailors. According to the information we have, most of the junior naval officers and middle and low-level officers of the Orientals are from the Etajima Naval Academy. There, it can be called the cradle of the Eastern Navy. If we can destroy it. At the same time, if all the students of the Eastern Navy who are studying there are wiped out, then this will undoubtedly be a devastating blow to the Eastern Navy. It will even cause the Eastern Navy to have a generational break. If the Orientals get the support of the Sun Never Sets, they can get loans from the Sun Never Sets, and they can buy or build their own warships. We'll be able to regain strength soon. However, if there is a lack of relevant talents, then, their combat power will definitely be greatly reduced. Mikhail explained. General Alexander nodded again and again, also thinking that this was a very good idea. Chapter 244, Bombarding Zhongtian Island Sea School, 4th update, please subscribe. Advertisement. Nothing can do more harm to a country than destroying its talent pool. Adajima Naval Academy, for the Toyo Navy, is the cradle of their reserve talents. A large number of low-level military officers, even middle and senior military officers, and even generals, all came from this school. The senior officials of the Eastern Army often graduated from here first, and then went to study in the empire on which the sun never sets. Once the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy destroys the Adajima Naval Academy, all the reserve talents being cultivated by the Toyo Navy will be eliminated. Well, one can imagine how much harm this will cause the Orientals. It is not so easy for the Eastern Navy to redevelop again. Even, the threat they can pose to the Russian Empire will be very, very limited. Your Majesty, this is a wonderful idea. I will immediately send a telegram to the home fleet to let them act. General Alexander said excitedly. Mikhail nodded, although the students of Adajima Naval Academy are still very young and full of vigor. However, once they grow up, they will inevitably become enemies of the Tsarist Empire. Get rid of them before they graduate, in that case, it will be most beneficial to the Tsarist Empire. From the standpoint of the Tsarist Russian Empire, and even the standpoint of his previous life, Mikhail did not feel the slightest sense of guilt after issuing this order. Subsequently, the Secretary of the Navy, General Alexander, sent a telegram to the home fleet. After the local fleet received the telegram, it quickly began to deploy. Adajima Naval Academy, founded in 1769, add 100 to the real time, is located on Adashima Island at the southern end of the Seto Inland Sea, across the sea from Kure Port Naval Base. If the Tsarist Russian Navy wanted to attack the Adajima Naval Academy, it had to enter the Seto Inland Sea first. After the defeat of the Eastern Navy, in order to stop the Tsarist Russian Navy and prepare for the attack of the Tsarist Russian Navy, mines were also deployed in some important waterways. This point must be well prepared for the job. Advertisement. Lieutenant General Rajhestvinsky and Lieutenant General Carlos Ma have discussed this issue. The hydrographic situation in the Seto Inland Sea is complicated, and there are also mines deployed by the Japanese. Our large battleships, even heavy cruisers or armored cruisers, should not go deep into it, so as not to cause unnecessary losses. Roger, Lieutenant General Winsky said. Lieutenant General Carlos Ma nodded. Near the Zhongtian Island Naval Academy, there is an Oriental fort. Although it has been in disrepair for a long time, most of the coastal defense guns equipped are old. However, it can still pose a threat to our warships. It is a certain threat. In addition, in order to ensure that the Naval Academy can be completely destroyed, it is still necessary to ensure that large-caliber naval guns are involved. Even if the battleships are not deployed, at least 1 or 2 heavy cruisers are required. 210 mm naval guns should be. It is guaranteed that all the buildings of the Adajima Naval Academy will be destroyed. Lieutenant General Rajhestvinsky thought about it and adopted this suggestion. Later, after their discussions, they decided to deploy 2 Mosk-class heavy cruisers, 2 Rostov-class light cruisers, and 4 A-class destroyers to form a raid fleet to be responsible for the implementation of this operation. In order to ensure the suddenness of the operation, the raid fleet needs to enter the Bungo Channel between Kyushu Island and Shikoku Island at night. Then enter the southern end of the Seto Inland Sea and go straight to Ada Island. The entire voyage was more than 180 kilometers that day. This makes the entire raid fleet need to maintain a speed of 20 knots throughout the journey. In this way, we will be able to reach Ada Island at night. Then after completing the attack on the Zhongtian Island Naval Academy, it will be safely withdrawn. If starting at 8 o'clock in the evening. Then, if there is no accident in the middle, you can successfully arrive at around 1 a.m. the next day. When the time comes, the raid fleet will have 1 hour to destroy the Adajima Naval Academy. Then go back quickly. Of course, it would be great if the battle could be resolved within half an hour. In this case, the raid fleet will be able to return successfully. Major General Nobergatov, the commander of the heavy cruiser formation, is fully responsible for commanding this operation. September 25, 1804 at 8 o'clock in the evening. The Tsarist Russian Navy raid fleet entered the Bungo waterway. At this moment, the sky has completely darkened. Visibility at sea is poor. The entire raid fleet was blacked out and radio silenced throughout. Therefore, the Orientals did not discover this fleet at all. In other words, the Orientals never thought that the Tsarist Russian Imperial Navy would do this. So that they have no defense at all. 0. Asking for flowers. On the heavy cruiser Mosk, the flagship of the raid fleet, Rear Admiral Nobergatov was concentrating and his expression was very dignified. He is very clear that there can be no mistakes in this action. Otherwise, the Japanese would be prepared, and it would be impossible for them to launch another surprise attack on the Adajima Naval Academy. Advertisement. Even if the Japanese do not have enough sea power to intercept them. But no matter how bad the Japanese are, you can order all the students of the Atajima Naval Music School to evacuate. In that case, even if the Tsarist Russian Navy destroyed the Atajima Naval Academy, it would not be able to deal with those naval cadets of the Orientals. The losses caused to the Eastern Navy will undoubtedly be much smaller. 00. Fortunately, the Tsarist Russian Navy's raid fleet was very lucky. Along the way, there was no danger and no Japanese mines were encountered. At 1 o'clock in the morning on September 26, the raid fleet successfully arrived at the Atajima Naval Academy. The fleet broke the hull only 5 or 6 kilometers away from the Atajima Naval Academy. Order the ships to fire at the maximum rate of fire. After half an hour, evacuate immediately. Major General Nobergatov ordered. In order to avoid being besieged by the torpedo boats of the Orientals, Major General Nobatov hoped to resolve the battle within half an hour. In terms of the firepower of 2 Mosk-class heavy cruisers, 2 Rostov-class light cruisers and 4 A-class destroyers, half an hour is enough to wipe out the Atajima Naval Academy. When the time comes, one can imagine what will happen to the students of the Eastern Navy. Fire. Following the order of the gunner of the heavy cruiser Mosk, 3 triple-mounted 210 mm main guns with 50 times the caliber began to roar. The remaining warships also started shelling immediately after. For a moment, Yin Huang's shells slammed into the Zhongtian Island Naval Academy. At this time, almost all the students of the Eastern Navy soldiers there were still asleep. Chapter 245 Dongyang admits defeat, 5th update, please subscribe. Advertisement. Boom. 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 Explosions sounded continuously in the Zhongtian Island Naval Academy, the flames soared into the sky, and the gunpowder smoke filled the air. The buildings in the school were destroyed in the explosion, and the earth, rocks, and rubble were carried by the shock wave and flew around. Many students of the Eastern Navy were blown to pieces while they were still asleep, and they were sent to see their Amaterasu god. There are also students of the Eastern Navy who were awakened by the sound of the explosion. Some even rushed out wrapped in loincloths. Baga. What's going on here? Who's attacking us? A teacher at Atajima Naval Academy cursed. Russians, it must be Russians calling. A student replied. Damn Russians, they attack our Naval Academy, they have a bad conscience. 440. Those Japanese students kept cursing the Russian Empire. However, this does not change their current predicament at all. On the sea, 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers of the Tsarist Russian Navy were still firing wildly. The 210 mm naval gun, 155 mm naval gun and 105 mm naval gun are all firing at the maximum rate of fire. So densely packed shells almost covered the entire Atajima Naval Academy. The school buildings, student dormitories, teacher dormitories, and material warehouses in the school were all destroyed by the fierce shelling of the Tsarist Russian Navy. The students of the Eastern Navy who were killed were countless. Those naval cadets who were not killed in the first bombing were all fleeing frantically, wanting to escape here. Advertisement. However, the shells that fell from the sky easily took their lives away. The defenders of the Toyo Navy at the Sangjeo fort not far from here also discovered that the Atajima Naval Academy had been attacked, and immediately began to fight back. Boom. Boom. The coastal defense guns opened fire one after another. The shell hit the sea, splashing a high column of water. However, it is night now. This makes the hit rate of those old coastal defense guns frighteningly low, although it looks lively. But in fact, it did not pose much threat to the Tsarist Russian Navy's raid fleet at all. However, the Tsarist Russian naval raid fleet has also understood that the Orientals have gradually reacted, and they need to hurry up. Otherwise, the torpedo boat departing from Wugang Naval Base will arrive soon. Within half an hour, the entire Zhongtian Island Naval Academy had been blown into ruins. The students and teachers here are even more lost. Those who survived were few and far between. The Tsarist Russian Navy's raid fleet has completed its mission and is heading back. When the entire raid fleet stopped shelling and entered the blackout situation, the coastal defense batteries of the Orientals couldn't even figure out where they were, let alone attack them. As a result, the operation of the Tsarist Russian Navy's raid fleet this time was very successful, with almost no losses of its own. However, the losses caused to the Orientals were very large. Especially for the Dongyang Navy, it directly caused them to lose a large number of outstanding students. If the Dongyang Navy wants to restore its strength next, it will not be so easy. Just having warships is not enough, there must be enough high-quality sailors and officers. Dongjing, the official residence of the Minister of the Navy. When Lieutenant Admiral Gonbei Yamamoto, Minister of the Navy of the Eastern Empire, was woken up in his sleep, and after learning what happened, he became even more furious. Advertisement. Baga. Damn Russians, why are they so vicious? They actually attacked our Naval Academy, they are simply inferior to animals. Many of those students are still children. They can do it too. Yamamoto Gonbei will cursed. His eyes were red, as if he was going to eat people. If possible, he even wished to kill all the Russians. Admiral Ito Yuhiro, Chief of Naval Command, also learned the news almost at the same time. Baga! Russians, we are at odds with you. Whether it is Lieutenant General Gonbei Yamamoto or General Ito Yuhiro, they all hate the Tsarist Empire. It can be seen that this operation of the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy has dealt a great blow to the Eastern Navy. Naturally, the top management of the Eastern Navy hated the Tsarist Russian Empire extremely. General Katsura, the Prime Minister of the Eastern Empire, was very angry after hearing the news, but there was also a hint of schadenfreude. The Navy suffered heavy losses, which is undoubtedly what the Army would like to see. This also means that the Navy will not be able to regain its strength for a long time in the future. Then, the Eastern Navy will naturally be unable to pose a threat to the Eastern Army. They can still firmly hold the power of the Eastern Empire. However, the blockade of the Eastern Empire by the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy has already caused very large losses to the Eastern Empire. Especially the loss in industry and commerce is very serious. Coupled with the soaring price of rice in the Eastern Empire, many ordinary people could no longer afford food. Selling children, daughters, and even bodies in order to survive can be seen everywhere. At the same time, the patience of the people is almost reaching its limit. This is undoubtedly a great threat to the Eastern Empire. Once the people couldn't bear it anymore, they began to rebel against the rule. Then, there will be very big problems in the rule of the Eastern Empire. This also aroused the vigilance of the upper echelons of the Eastern Empire. In addition, although the empire on which the sun never sets is putting pressure on the Russian Empire, it has no effect at all. So much so that the attitude of the Tsarist Russian Empire is still very firm. If the Eastern Empire does not accept the conditions put forward by the Russian Empire, the war will continue. The blockade of the Eastern Empire will also continue. 4.3 This left the Eastern Empire with no other options. Gentlemen, we can't hold on any longer. If this continues, our industry, our people's livelihood, and even our economy and the whole society will collapse. Therefore, I intend to accept the terms of the Russians. However, this is only temporary. After we become strong again, we can tear up the treaty and take back Hokkaido Island at any time. Even, if we can defeat the Russians in future wars, then we can ask the Russians for more war reparations. We will pay back all the shame that the Russians have imposed on us today. General Katsura said to the cabinet ministers of the Eastern Empire. Although the ministers were extremely aggrieved, they also knew that they had no other choice. Chapter 246 Mosque Peace Treaty, First Update, please subscribe. Russian Empire, Moskva Grand Hotel. Yasuya Uchida, the Minister of the Eastern Empire to the Tsarist Russian Empire, is visiting the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Empire on which the sun never sets, Philip Morris. Your Excellency, the country has issued an order. We can't bear it anymore. We can't hold on anymore. Advertisement. We must reach an agreement with the Russians as soon as possible to end this war and let the Russians stop blocking us. Otherwise, our industry and economy, as well as people's livelihood, will collapse. Minister Yasuya Uchida looked dejected. Fitzmaurice nodded, he understood. After all, the current situation is indeed very unfavorable for the Orientals. In addition, the Tsarist Russian Empire is one of the most powerful countries in the world. When the sun never sets on the empire and is not ready to go to war with the Tsarist Russian Empire, the pressure they can exert on the Tsarist Russian Empire is actually very limited. This allowed the Tsarist Russian Empire to not give face to the empire on which the sun never sets. During the negotiation, there will be no more compromises and concessions. Okay, Your Excellency the Minister. If you are willing to accept the conditions of the Russians, then everything will be much easier. A peace treaty will be signed soon, and this war will end. Fitzmaurice said. Your Excellency, we are only temporarily bowing to the Russians. One day, we will definitely defeat the Russians and retake Hokkaido Island. And let the Russians pay a heavy price. Minister Yasuya Uchida said through gritted teeth. Fitzmaurice expressed his recognition and support for the mentality of the Orientals. Even, the sun never sets, people wish that the Orientals would hate the Russians. In this case, we can continue to use the pawn of the Orientals to contain part of the power of the Russians. This is also very beneficial to the global strategy of the empire on which the sun never sets. Minister, the empire will help you, let you quickly overcome the difficulties, and quickly become stronger again. Fitzmaurice said. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. However, there is a very big problem now, that is, the Russians' demand for war reparations. We simply cannot afford so much money. I am afraid that we need a loan from the empire on which the sun never sets. Okay. Minister Yasuya Uchida said. After hearing this, Fitzmaurice couldn't help frowning. Advertisement. 1.5 billion rubles, if converted into pounds, is more than 166 million pounds. Even for the empire on which the sun never sets, this is a huge sum of money. You know, the annual financial revenue of the empire on which the sun never sets is only over 150 million pounds. It's just that, in addition to these taxes, the empire on which the sun never sets can also collect a lot of wealth from various colonies. Otherwise, how could they maintain the most powerful navy in the world? I can persuade the country to lend a sum of money to your country. However, the amount of money cannot be too much, let alone more than 160 million pounds. I am afraid that you still have to pay in installments. Of course, next, the empire will give you support from other aspects, so that you can recover your strength as soon as possible. Fitzmaurice said. Minister Yasuya Uchida nodded. Even if the method of installment payment is adopted, this is also a large sum of money for the Eastern Empire. After all, the annual financial revenue of the Eastern Empire is only 390 million yen, which is equivalent to 38 million pounds. But now the Eastern Empire has nothing to do. If it is not only by reaching an agreement with the Tsarist Russian Empire to end this war, then their country will really collapse. At that time, their losses will be even greater. Subsequently, the negotiations between the Tsarist Russian Empire and the Eastern Empire started again. This time, the attitude of the Eastern Empire was much better. Said that the island of Hokkaido could be ceded to the Russian Empire. However, it is believed that the amount of war reparations of 1.5 billion rubles is too much. Therefore, I hope that the Russian Empire can reduce the amount of part of the war reparations. The empire on which the sun never sets also spoke out for the Eastern Empire, claiming that the war compensation of 1.5 billion rubles was too large. Your Excellency Minister, Your Excellency Minister. The 1.5 billion ruble war indemnity is not much. You know, the empire mobilized most of its army and all of its navy in this war. The money spent in this battle alone, the war materials are not a small amount. Adding in the compensation for the casualties, it will cost a lot of money. The 1.5 billion rubles are all spent on it, and it is not enough. Siversky said. Our loss is greater than yours. Minister Uchida Yasuya argued. Advertisement. That's what you asked for. If you didn't start this war, wouldn't you have to pay these losses? Siversky asked rhetorically. This immediately left Minister Uchida Yasuya speechless. Indeed, the reason why the Eastern Empire provoked this war was because they thought they were sure to win and could defeat the Russians. Unexpectedly, it ended in a fiasco in the end. Dongyang people are so extreme, they want to gamble everything. After the final failure, but also to pay a heavy price for it. However, if the Eastern Empire cannot afford the money, it can be paid in installments. Within this year, pay 500 million rubles. In the future, it will be enough to pay 100 million rubles every year. Siversky proposed a solution way. In this case, 920 is not unbearable in terms of the financial resources of the Eastern Empire. However, it will be very difficult. Moreover, if the Eastern Empire wants to continue to develop a strong military force, it may not be enough. Of course, that requires the full support of the empire on which the sun never sets. None of this is a problem if the empire on which the sun never sets is willing to help. Minister Yasuya Uchida reported the conditions of the Tsarist Empire to the country. The top management of the Eastern Empire, who had been driven to a dead end, naturally could no longer refuse, and accepted these conditions in full. Under such circumstances, the two sides reached an agreement in the negotiations. On October 7, 1804, Siversky, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Tsarist Russian Empire, and Yasuya Uchida, Minister of the Eastern Empire to the Russian Empire, signed their names on the peace treaty, which marked the war between the Russian Empire and the Eastern Empire. It's over for now. This war ended with the victory of the Tsarist Russian Empire. Of course, even if a peace treaty is signed, anyone with a discerning eye can see that this is just a temporary truce. Once the Eastern Empire becomes stronger again, they will inevitably tear up the treaty and start a war with the Russian Empire again. It's just that the current Eastern Empire is not an opponent of the Tsarist Russian Empire. Will they be able to beat the Tsarist Russian Empire in the future? Chapter 247 The Empire will win next time. Second update, please subscribe. The Tsarist Russian Empire signed a peace treaty with the Eastern Empire, and the war between the two countries ended and peace was restored. The result of this war shocked all countries in the world. At the same time, I also further saw the power of the Tsarist Russian Empire. The army of the Tsarist Russian Empire is definitely one of the most powerful armies in the world. The navy of the Tsarist Russian Empire is also a world-class navy. Advertisement. The military strength of the Tsarist Russian Empire is naturally conceivable. The international status of the Tsarist Russian Empire has also been greatly improved because of this. If it is said that the Tsarist Russian Empire was often considered a giant with mud feet among the great powers. So now, the Tsarist Russian Empire is definitely a real giant. Even if the industrial strength of the Russian Empire is relatively weak. However, this did not hinder the power of the Russian Empire. Moscow, Kremlin. Tsar Mikhail held the original copy of the Musk Peace Treaty in his hand and read it carefully. All the cabinet ministers of the Tsarist Russian Empire had smiles on their faces. We hope that the Tsarist Russian Empire can win this war. Moreover, they also gained huge benefits during the war, and they are all very satisfied. The Musk Peace Treaty stipulates that the Eastern Empire compensates the Tsarist Russian Empire with 1.5 billion rubles in war indemnities, and the first batch of 500 million rubles will be paid to the Tsarist Russian Empire before this year. The remaining 1 billion rubles will be divided into 10 installments, with 100 million rubles paid each year. At the same time, the Eastern Empire ceded the island of Hokkaido to the Russian Empire. Moreover, the Eastern Empire recognized that the Koryo Peninsula was the sphere of influence of the Tsarist Russian Empire, and no longer sought expansion on the Koryo Peninsula in any form. Your Majesty, the war is over. The Imperial Army can now withdraw to Europe, Central Asia and Siberia in batches. During this period of time, the main force of the Imperial Army has been concentrated in the Far East, and other places are extremely empty. Minister of War Sokeiho General Mlinov said. Mikhail nodded. The European part is the core area of the Tsarist Russian Empire. The most important military force of the Tsarist Russian Empire will naturally be deployed in Europe. Otherwise, this will result in an empty force in the core area of the Tsarist Russian Empire. Once a war breaks out suddenly, I am afraid it will be too late to react. Your Majesty, the Imperial Navy is also preparing to withdraw to the European region, said the Secretary of the Navy, General Alexander. The Navy waits until the situation in the Far East stabilizes before withdrawing. After all, if the local fleet is withdrawn to Europe and redivided into the Northern Fleet and the Black Sea Fleet, then, with the strength of the Pacific Fleet, it is far from being able to make peace with Japan. Fall into confrontation. Mikhail said. Yes, Your Majesty. General Alexander nodded. Advertisement. Your Majesty, although the Empire defeated the Dongyang people in this battle, neither the Dongyang people nor the masters behind them are very unconvinced. Or they are even more hostile to the Empire. You don't need to think about it. The Dongyang people will definitely try their best to restore their military strength. And the people who never set the sun will try their best to rearm them. Once the Dongyang people become stronger again, they will definitely become enemies with the Empire again. If the Empire fails next time if you defeat the Orientals and lose instead, then the consequences will be disastrous. Prime Minister Donovan Schiff reminded. Yes, Your Majesty. The Orientals are too crazy. The main reason why they were defeated by us this time is that they underestimated the Empire too much. In other words, they were not prepared at all. Next time, I will definitely make complete preparations before attacking the Empire. General Sukhumlinov, Minister of War, also expressed his opinion. Everyone is not dazzled by the victory. It is very good to be able to understand this. Although the war between us and the Japanese is over this time, peace has been achieved. However, this is only a temporary truce. Wait until once the Orientals regain their strength, they will definitely go to war with the Empire again. Therefore, we must not relax, and we must also prepare for war. Once the Orientals start a war again, we will definitely destroy the Orientals. And, let the Japanese pay a greater price for this. Mikhail said. Yes, Your Majesty. All the ministers answered one after another. The Tsarist Russian Empire defeated the Orientals in this battle and gained huge benefits. Then, naturally, it will not be allowed to be defeated by the Orientals in the future. In that case, not only will the Tsarist Russian Empire pay a huge price, but it will also make the Tsarist Russian Empire a laughingstock of the whole world. First of all, we need to strengthen the construction of the Far East. Our population is growing rapidly, and the population in Europe is large. Next, we can gradually migrate to Siberia and the Far East to enrich the population of this region and speed up the development of these regions. The double-track construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway must also be put on the agenda. Try to complete the double track within 10 years. In this way, the transport capacity of the Trans-Siberian Railway will be greatly improved. The connection between the hinterland of the Empire and Siberia and the Far East will also be even closer. Even if a war breaks out in the future, the Empire can transport as many troops as possible to the Far East by railway if the sea route is blocked. Mikhail said to everyone. Siberia and the Far East are very rich regions. Although the natural conditions are a bit poor, it can't stand the extremely rich resources. If the Tsarist Russian Empire can gradually develop these places, it will inevitably increase its national strength. Don't you see that the old men of later generations can get huge wealth every year by selling oil and natural gas, as well as timber and other mineral resources? Otherwise, Laomazi would not be called Wangzhou's, a gas station disguised as a country. Secondly, the empire must strengthen its industrialization. In modern warfare, it is the industry. Although the industry of the empire has made great progress over the years, there is still a big gap compared with other industrial powers. I hope, in the next 2 decades, the empire's industry will be able to achieve considerable development and become a first-class industrial power. Not only will the industrial output value break into the top 3 in the world. At the same time, in the high-tech field, it will also be further closer to other Western powers. Only in this way can the empire become truly stronger. Then, in future wars, if the Orientals dare to provoke the empire again, the empire will definitely defeat them and make them pay a heavier price. Mikhail wanted the Russian Empire to become an industrial power. Only in this way can he truly support his ambition. Chapter 248 Upgrading to the Pacific Fleet, 3rd update, please subscribe. For the Empire, the most important thing is still to maintain a strong military strength. This time, the war indemnity that the Empire got from the Orientals, in addition to the compensation for the dead and disabled soldiers, and the consumption of various materials besides, the rest will be used for military expenses. In the next 10 years, the Empire will continue to strengthen the construction of the army. By the way, I want to remind you a little bit. No one is allowed to reach out for pensions. Advertisement. Otherwise, you will have to go to a court-martial, or go directly to the gallows. Mikhail reminded. Mikhail knew very well that the officials of the Tsarist Russian Empire were not so clean. Even after succeeding to the throne, the Ministry of Supervision was established to supervise officials at all levels of the Tsarist Russian Empire. A large number of officials who violated the law and discipline were also arrested. However, it is not so easy to reverse the official atmosphere that has been formed in the Tsarist Russian Empire for so many years. It has to be done step by step. Mikhail absolutely can't tolerate it. Those moths have their hands on the pension. The soldiers of the Empire, in order to win the war, gave their lives, or were injured and disabled. If even 443 can't get enough care for them. So, will anyone still fight for the Empire? Therefore, Mikhail has absolutely zero tolerance for this problem. Yes, Your Majesty. General Sukhumlinov, Minister of War, and General Alexander, Minister of Navy, answered one after another. They are well aware of the attitude of His Majesty the Tsar, so naturally they dare not have an accident on this issue. Otherwise, it will be a big trouble. In terms of the army, the Imperial Army will still maintain the establishment of 7 group armies. However, the reserve and mobilization systems need to be further strengthened. The next time a war breaks out, I am afraid that the whole of Europe will be involved in it. At that time, the Imperial Army needs to mobilize an extremely large number of troops in the shortest possible time to ensure that the safety and interests of the Empire will not be damaged. Mikhail ordered. 10 years later, if nothing else, it will be a world war. Within these 10 years, the Tsarist Russian Empire must be fully prepared. At least it will not wait until after the outbreak of the war. The army will not be able to complete the mobilization for a long time. Then prematurely invested in the war with the Germans, resulting in extremely heavy losses to the army of the Tsarist Russian Empire. You know, in the First World War in another time and space, the Germans only deployed one army group to defend the Tsarist Empire in the east, and the rest of the main force fought against the Gauls on the western front, almost knocking the Gauls out of shit. If the sun never sets had not sent a large number of expeditionary troops for reinforcements, the Gauls might have been killed. When the situation in Gaul was very critical, the Tsarist Russian Empire, as an ally, launched a large-scale attack on the Germanic Empire before it was ready. But unfortunately, instead, they were beaten by the Germans and suffered heavy losses. This time, Mikhail said nothing to let such history repeat itself. Of course, for the Tsarist Russian Empire, it is undoubtedly very beneficial for the Germanic people to fight against the Gauls and the Sunshine people. Advertisement. So, in Mikhail's plan, once the World War broke out and the Germans wanted to implement their Schlieffen plan, the Tsarist Russian Empire would just sit back and watch. At the same time, the Tsarist Russian Empire first concentrated its main force and launched an attack on the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and first defeated the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In this case, the Tsarist Russian Empire will be able to successfully include all the Western Slavs and Yugoslavs into the rule. The plan to establish a large Slavic empire will also be easily realized. After the Germans, Gauls, and people who never set the sun were exhausted and paid a heavy price, the Tsarist Russian Empire launched an attack on the Germans, ending the war in one fell swoop, and grabbing huge war benefits. Isn't that great? However, the plan is like this. However, once a war breaks out in the future, it is hard to say how it will develop. It is often the plan that cannot keep up with the changes. And what Mikhail can do is to make the Russian Empire as strong as possible and prepare as much as possible. In this case, no matter how many changes there are, it will not have much impact. Yes, Your Majesty, replied General Sukhumlinov, Minister of War. In terms of the Navy, the next step for the Imperial Navy is still the construction of the 4 major fleets. However, the Pacific Fleet performed very well in this battle. In addition, after the Empire occupied Hokkaido Island, the situation in the Far East and the Pacific region has changed. Huge changes have taken place. Therefore, I am going to upgrade the Pacific Fleet, and let the Pacific Fleet be upgraded from an offshore defense fleet to a main force fleet. Mikhail said. Admiral Alexander, the Secretary of the Navy, was overjoyed. After the Pacific Fleet has been upgraded to the main fleet, it will naturally be equipped with the main fleet. In this way, each of the Northern Fleet and the Black Sea Fleet will have 1 Mikhail I-class battleships to the Pacific Fleet. In addition, 6 more Mosk-class heavy cruisers, 12 Rostov-class light cruisers and 18 A-class destroyers will be built next. These warships are all assigned to the Pacific Fleet. In addition, the planned number of Ismail-class battlecruisers that the Empire is preparing to build has also increased from 4 to 6, with 2 ships each for the Northern Fleet, Black Sea Fleet, and Pacific Fleet. Mikhail ordered. Yes, Your Majesty. General Alexander nodded repeatedly. Once the Pacific Fleet has served a large number of advanced warships, it doesn't take much to know that the Pacific Fleet will be greatly improved. Your Majesty, what about the battleships and armored cruisers originally equipped by the Pacific Fleet, as well as the battleships and armored cruisers captured in this war? General Alexander asked. Those warships should all be under the command of the Pacific Fleet. After all, the pressure on the Pacific Fleet will be great. They will have to face the Far East Fleet of the Empire on which the sun never sets, as well as the Orientals who are quickly recovering their strength. Those battleships and armored cruisers, although it is beginning to be outdated. But in the next 10 years, it will still be able to have a certain combat effectiveness. Especially in the Far East, it can also come in handy. Mikhail said. Yes, Your Majesty. General Alexander replied. In this case, the Pacific Fleet will instead become the fleet with the most warships and the most powerful fleet in the Tsarist Russian Navy. Chapter 249 Unreconciled Orientals, 4th more, please subscribe. After the Pacific Fleet of the Tsarist Russian Navy was upgraded to the main fleet, its strength increased greatly. Not only does it have 2 of the most powerful Mikhail I-class battleships in the world. At the same time, it will also be equipped with 6 Mosk-class heavy cruisers, 12 Rostov-class light cruisers, and 18 A-class destroyers. In addition, the 4 Ekaterina II battleships originally equipped by the Pacific Fleet, the Navalin battleship, 2 Alexander II battleships, the 12 Apostles battleship, the Gangat, the Peter the Great battleship, and the 5 Sovereign-class battleships captured during the war. The number of battleships equipped by the Pacific Fleet has reached 17. Advertisement. Of course, 15 of them are ex-dreadnoughts. Moreover, there are 5 former dreadnoughts whose combat effectiveness is very bad, and can only be used as coastal defense warships. Perhaps, in another 10 years or so, these former dreadnoughts will be largely retired. In addition, the Pacific Fleet is also equipped with the armored cruiser Tsarist Empire, the armored cruiser Rurik, plus the 6 Cressy-class armored cruisers and Drake captured during the war. Armored cruiser. And several protected cruisers. It is conceivable how powerful the current Pacific Fleet is. Even if it is a direct confrontation with the Far East Fleet of the Royal Navy, the sun never sets, it will not be at a disadvantage at all. After all, at present, the sun never sets on the Far East Fleet of the Imperial Navy, and the main force is 3 Sovereign-class battleships, 6 Duncan-class battleships and 6 Old Man Star battleships. Battleship. Although in the future, the Eastern Empire must restore its military strength. Even, with the support of the sun never sets, the military strength will be restored soon. However, the construction of warships takes a lot of time. It will take at least a few years, or even longer, until the Eastern Empire can pose a threat to the Tsarist Russian Empire's navy again. Besides, the Island Naval Academy was destroyed by the Tsarist Russian Navy, which dealt a devastating blow to the talents of the Eastern Navy. This even makes the Eastern Empire Navy will be broken. It will undoubtedly be even more difficult for the Ocean Empire Navy to redevelop again. And these will buy more time for the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy to develop. Maybe, when the World War breaks out in the future, the navy of the Eastern Empire has not yet redeveloped. Of course, even if the Eastern Ocean Empire Navy has redeveloped and grown by then. However, with the outbreak of the World War, as the master of the Orientals, the sun never sets, and he will never allow the Orientals to provoke the Tsarist Russian Empire. At that time, there is a high probability that the 2 sides will become allies. Next, the development focus of the Tsarist Russian Empire was still industry, as well as the mobilization system of the army and the construction of the reserve force, rather than the navy. Therefore, after the world's navies entered the era of dreadnoughts and started a large-scale naval equipment competition, the Tsarist Russian Empire would not follow up, but would instead apply limited military expenditures to other directions. For example, the army's new weapons, and the air force and so on. There is also the preparation for the next World War. Before the war broke out, the Tsarist Russian Empire must first reserve enough weapons, equipment, and ammunition. Only in this way can we ensure that once a future war breaks out, the Tsarist Empire can have enough weapons and equipment to arm more troops. Let our core troops be on the battlefield, have enough war materials to consume, and so on. Mikhail knew very well that once a future world war broke out, the duration and severity would far exceed the expectations of other countries. This is also the reason why the whole of Europe is battered in the war. Advertisement. If the Tsarist Russian Empire is fully prepared, the losses will naturally be much smaller, and it will be able to persist for a longer period of time in future wars. While the Tsarist Russian Empire is enjoying the fruits of victory and making plans for the next war, the Eastern Empire, the loser of this war, is in a gloomy state. The Orientals never imagined that they would lose in this war, and they would lose completely. So much so that after the war ended, the entire Eastern Empire fell into extreme difficulties. Fortunately, after the Tsarist Russian Empire lifted the blockade of the Eastern Empire, the maritime trade lines were restored. The backlog of goods by the Orientals can be shipped abroad for sale. At the same time, raw materials purchased from abroad can be shipped back to China, allowing the industrial enterprises of the Eastern Empire to start operating. 0. Ask for flowers. The most important thing is that the large amount of grain purchased by the Eastern Empire from abroad can be shipped back to the country, so that the rising rice price can be calmed down. To a certain extent, this also eased the anger of the people of the Eastern Empire, and made the domestic situation of the Eastern Empire less tense. Of course, the Eastern Empire suffered a crushing defeat in this war. This also had a great conflict with the political structure of the Eastern Empire. The entire army of the Eastern Empire Navy was annihilated, making the Eastern Empire Navy almost lost the right to speak at the top. The Eastern Empire Army lost almost all of its main force, which also caused the Eastern Empire Army to suffer heavy losses. Even after the war ended, the Tsarist Russian Empire released those prisoners of war. However, the power of the Eastern Empire Army is shrinking day by day. 0. In addition to this failure, someone must always be responsible for this failure. Therefore, Gui Taro's cabinet led by the army stepped down without accident. Under Ming Zetianhuang's instruction, Ziwan Temple Gongwang became the new prime minister of the Eastern Empire, and took the stage to take pictures. Ming Zetianhuang specially summoned Prime Minister Gongwang of Ziwan Temple and expressed his earnest hopes for him. Mr. Ziwanzai, the empire has suffered heavy losses in this war, and it has suffered a crushing defeat. Not only has the wealth accumulated by the empire over the years, its military power and prestige been completely lost, but it has also left the empire facing a very critical situation. However, I am very unwilling to lose to the Russians this time. I am extremely unwilling. I hope that after you become the Prime Minister of the Empire, you can make the Empire stronger and restore its military strength quickly. One day, the Empire must take revenge, we must defeat the Russians. The shame that the Russians imposed on the Empire this time will be returned thousands of times. At the same time, the Empire will not only take back the island of Hokkaido, but also occupy more territories of the Russians in the Far East. Ming Zetianhuang gritted his teeth and said. Even though his health is getting worse and worse now, his hatred for the Russian Empire has not diminished in the slightest. On the contrary, he hated the Tsarist Russian Empire even more. Chapter 250 Reckless and Tasteful, 5th more, please subscribe. Gongwang of Ziwan Temple is not a member of the military, but a leader of the civil service faction. In addition, he has a noble status and aristocratic background, and he also has great influence in the top management of the Eastern Empire. Ming Zetianhuang was very dissatisfied with the performance of the military. Therefore, this time, civil servants will be allowed to come to power to form a cabinet. However, even if a civil servant is appointed as the prime minister of the cabinet. However, Ming Zetianhuang was still brooding about the defeat of this war, and was still very unwilling. He hoped that the Eastern Empire could quickly prepare its army for war, become stronger, and find another chance to defeat the Tsarist Russian Empire. In front of Ming Zetianhuang, Gongwang of Ziwan Temple naturally promised to do his best to defeat the Russians. However, he also deeply felt that this was a very serious problem. Advertisement. After Ziwan Temple Gongwang came to power, he reorganized the July 13th cabinet and nominated candidates for new cabinet ministers. Ming Zetianhuang also approved all the candidates for these cabinet ministers. He has very high expectations for this term of the cabinet. In the new cabinet of the Eastern Empire, Kato Takeki will be the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Takeki Hara will be the Minister of Internal Affairs, Lieutenant General Teraka Masayoshi will continue to be the Minister of War, Lieutenant General Sato Minoru will be the Minister of the Navy, and Sakatani will be the Minister of Inzoku. Yoshiro is in charge. Lieutenant General Masaki Teraka continued to serve as Minister of the Army, because there was no suitable candidate in the Army. As for the Navy, because of the disastrous defeat of the Navy, it directly caused the defeat of the Eastern Empire in this war. Therefore, even if Lieutenant General Gonbei Yamamoto is known as the father of the Navy, he must bear the responsibility for it. Just stepping down is already a very lenient punishment. Some radicals even demanded a seppuku apology from him. It's just that Lieutenant General Gonbei Yamamoto was more sensible and remained unmoved by these voices. After Prime Minister Gongwang Ziwanji came to power to form a cabinet, he immediately held a cabinet meeting. He needed to formulate the next development plan for the Eastern Empire. Gentlemen, the empire has just experienced a disastrous defeat, so that the empire has paid a huge loss this time. Not only did we lose the island of Hokkaido, but we also have to bear more than 1.6 billion yen in war reparations. At the same time, our navy has been almost wiped out, our army has suffered heavy losses. The whole country has become extremely weak. Coupled with the previous naval blockade by the Russians, the empire's industry, economy, and even people's livelihood are facing extremely serious problems. Next, we must find a way to tide over the difficulties and let the empire restore its strength as soon as possible. Prime Minister Gongwang of Ziwan Temple said to the crowd. Thousands of cabinet ministers are very clear that the current situation is very critical. If it is not handled properly, the Eastern Empire will decline step by step, or even face collapse. As the top executives of the Eastern Empire, they naturally don't want the Eastern Empire to collapse. In that case, the whole country will be doomed. Advertisement. Your Excellency, the loan promised by the man on whom the sun never sets has been in place. The major banks of the empire on which the sun never sets provide the empire with a loan of 100 million pounds. However, the empire needs tariffs as collateral. After this loan is in place, in addition to the 500 million rubles paid to the Russians, there is still a lot left. We can use this loan to restore the economy and promote the development of industry, said Minister of Finance Yoshiro Sakatani. What about the army? The Imperial Army lost a large number of soldiers in this battle, and many people were disabled. They all need a lot of pensions. In addition, the Imperial Army needs to rebuild its army so that it can defeat the Russians in the future. Lieutenant General Teraki Masaki, Minister of the Army, put forward his own opinion. Although the Eastern Empire Army lost this battle, however, they are not reconciled. There is even a common view among the Eastern Empire Army that the reason why they lost was entirely because the Navy did not live up to expectations. If the Eastern Ocean Empire Navy can defeat the Tsarist Russian Empire Navy and win the naval battle, then, the Eastern Empire Army can continuously send more troops to the battlefield. Even if the Eastern Army is at a disadvantage on the battlefield, they can defeat the Tsarist Russian Empire and win the final victory of the war by further exerting their superiority in strength. Therefore, after the war ended, the Eastern Empire Army couldn't wait to rebuild a powerful army. Teraka-kun, right now we don't have any extra financial resources to build the army. We have to find a way to restore the economy first. Then we can talk about the rebuilding of the army. However, I can assure you that all of this it is temporary. After our financial situation improves, we will definitely revive our armaments, said Ziwanzai Gongwang. Wait until the financial situation improves? When will we have to wait? Don't forget, the Russians have already occupied Hokkaido Island. Their warships often appear in the waters near the empire. Everyone knows what the Russians are thinking. If we don't have strong military strength, how can we resist the Russian invasion? Lieutenant General Masaki Teraki asked rhetorically. People who never set the sun will not tolerate the Russians continuing to invade us. They will definitely stand by our side and provide us with help. Gongwang Ziwanzai explained. Humph. Do you expect the sun to never set? They are unreliable at all. They just use us as pawns. And they are pawns that can be discarded at any time. Lieutenant General Genji in the temple snorted coldly. The people on whom the sun never sets are indeed unreliable. However, they have provided us with a lot of help. Among other things, the loans provided to us this time will allow us to have money to pay war reparations. Otherwise, even if we sell everything we can, we still can't get so much war reparations together. If we can't pay the war reparations, the Russians won't let us go. Foreign Minister Takeki Kato said. The reason why Lauren did this on the 3.8th day is just to use us. They want to use us as cannon fodder and continue to let us deal with the Russians. Masahiro said. No matter what ulterior secrets the people on whom the sun never sets have. However, the empire is now in extreme difficulties. The support and help of the people on whom the sun never sets will help the empire to tide over the difficulties. Has been of great help. Therefore, we cannot do without the support of people who never set the sun. From now on, we need to live our lives. After we get out of the current predicament, we will definitely rearm our armaments. When the time is right, I will definitely challenge the Russians again and strive for revenge of shame. Prime Minister Gongwang Ziwanji expressed his attitude to everyone.